Nearly tripped over as my first act.
That would have been flying Tory. Mike.
Good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to LUU's General Election Candidate Question Time with the local candidates for Leeds North West. Thank you very much to everyone for coming this evening. My name is Georgia. I'm a fourth-year English Literature student and a student staff member. I work as the forum facilitator here at LUU. My role tonight is impartial. I'm here to facilitate the questions and debate, and also to ensure that the questions are answered by each of the candidates. So I'd like to welcome the candidates. We've got Alex Sobel for Labour. Alan Lamb for the Conservatives. Greg Mulholland for the Liberal Democrats. And we have Martin Hemingway for the Green Party. So Leeds North West, as you know, is a very student-heavy constituency. So by inviting the local candidates to respond directly to student concerns, we'll hopefully be able to make a more informed decision on June the 8th. So before we begin, I just want to mention a couple of things to help ensure tonight runs smoothly. So we've got some quite strict timings this evening. We want to give each candidate an equal chance to voice their views. The debate will obviously encompass a wide range of political stances. So I'd like the audience to respect the views of the candidates and of each other, so please don't use any offensive language. It's understandable that you may want to applaud at certain points, but in the interest of time, we won't be applauding after every answer. And cheering or booing, on the other hand, would be inappropriate. There are students here with accessibility needs that might be disturbed with loud noises, so please be considerate of that and pop your mobiles on silent or anything else that could disturb this. Thank you. So the way that tonight is going to work is that each candidate will have the opportunity to present a 2-minute opening speech. And when all the candidates have finished their opening remarks, we're going to take predetermined audience questions that students have sent in to us or written on one of the posters you might have seen around campus on topics that are of national and local interest to Leeds students. So the topics we're going to look at tonight are living in Leeds, Brexit, education, health and environment. We'll also be taking questions from the floor, of course, and on social media, so feel free to tweet us at Leeds Uni Union and use the hashtag GE17. Just make sure your questions are not candidate specific because, like I said, we want everyone to have the chance to answer them. In a randomised order, the candidates will have 1 minute to answer each question, and towards the end of the debate, they will also be able to make a 1-minute closing statement. So let's begin with the opening speeches, and I'm going to come to Alex first.
Okay, thank you. Oh. Okay, thank you. I'm really pleased to be back here at Leeds University Union and to thank Leeds Beckett Student Union, Leeds University Union for putting on the candidate question time. I was at the University of Leeds for 5 years, including a year on the Student Union Executive, and I then went on to study at Leeds Beckett University. And it's great to see the work that's been done on the Riley Smith Hall. I think it's looking great. And it's great to see so many of you here tonight, especially during this busy period of having exams in this quite unexpected election that's been called. It's interesting that Leeds North West is made up of 27% of 18 to 24-year-olds, the largest single age group in the constituency. But at the last general election, a much smaller proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds registered to vote, and even less voted in the election. In this election, if you register and vote in Leeds North West, it's in your hands who will become the MP. I could stand here and talk about the great set of policies in the Labour manifesto, like raising the minimum wage to £10 an hour, ending unpaid internships, creating a decency standard for private rented homes, which will be enforced, and of course, abolishing university tuition fees. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that your voice is heard and your power is realised, that you're registered to vote and that you tell your housemates, your friends, your course mates, the people in your sports clubs, people in your student union, society to register and vote, because the voices of young people and your hopes and dreams have been neglected over the last 7 years. Just look at what happened to tuition fees after the coalition took power in 2010. But if I'm elected MP, I won't stop listening to you, and neither will the Labour Party. Your concerns are our concerns. Just listen to our manifesto pledges during the debate, and I'm sure that you'll see that we're fighting your corner. The future is owned by you, and if you choose to use it, you have the power to change our society. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to Alan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real privilege to be selected to stand in the election for Leeds North West. My name's Alan. I was born and raised in Leeds. I'm a Leeds City Councillor. I represent Wetherby. I've been on the council for 10 years. For those of you that are playing election bingo, I'm going to get strong and stable leadership out of the way straight away and coalition of chaos immediately, just so you can mark those off. This election is really important, and it's really important for all of you, because the decisions that are made by the next government will disproportionately affect every single one of you. And I think Alex and I can probably agree on that. We might part ways on certain times, but to start off with, we can agree on that. Whether it's about Brexit, whether it's about climate change, education and tuition fees, whether it's about housing and healthcare, all the decisions that the next Parliament are going to make will affect this generation of people far more than any other. I don't want to say too much other than to agree with Alex on one more thing. I'd urge every one of you to vote, whether at the end of this you decide to vote for my party or not. It's really important that you take part. It's a real privilege in this country that we can change governments without taking arms, without going and shooting and killing people, but by going and getting a little stubby pencil and marking down to a village hall and marking a cross in a box. And with that one act, we can change a government. And that power is in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, over to you.
Thanks very much, George. And first of all, a big thank you to Leeds University Union and to Leeds Beckett Union for organising this, and for organising this in a pretty challenging context, with exams going on and with the snap election having been called in the way it did, with so little notice for everyone. And one thing I did want to say very strongly is, regardless of your political views, I think it's an absolute disgrace that Theresa May has called an election at a time when many students will be in the middle of exams, or at a time when it will be difficult to vote. And I certainly also would urge you all to vote in this very, very important election. I'm very proud that I've been the MP for Leeds North West, including Headingley, where many students live, for 12 years now. And I have, throughout that time, represented many hundreds of students with issues such as bad landlords, with not getting bonds back, with problems with the student loan company. And I have raised issues on behalf of students and indeed university staff on many occasions. And I want to continue to do that, to be accessible, to be doing my local surgeries in Sainsbury's that many of you drop into. But I also want to be part of an effective opposition to this divisive, increasingly right-wing and cruel Conservative government led by Theresa May. And I'm sorry to say that I have seen over the last year the Labour Party more interested in fighting themselves on the green benches in the House of Commons than actually doing that. I want to be part of an opposition that really challenges the government. And my simple question to you is not just what sort of MP do you want, but what kind of country do you want to live in? And I do not like the direction that Theresa May is taking this country in. I certainly don't think that whatever the result last year means that she has any right to take us through the hard Brexit, which will damage jobs. And I do believe people need another say. So if you think that we're not on the right path, I would say look to the Liberal Democrats in this election.
Thank you. And Martin.
Hi. Again, I'm very pleased to have been asked here. I did do one course at Leeds Beckett, so one of my postgraduate diplomas is from there. I've lived in the constituency for the last 30-odd years and have spent time both in the Labour Party and the Green Party. For 12 years, I was a Labour councillor, up until I couldn't defend Labour policies anymore. And the one that drove me out particularly was PFI, and the adherence to PFI under the government that came in. Service, so much damage to schools, so much damage to, well, a range of other facilities, whether it's roads or other contracts like that. Now, it's important you think about two things when you're registering to vote. And one is about, where is your vote going to be most effective? If you're registered here, is your vote going to be most effective here with a postal vote? Or is it going to be most effective where you live? Again, it doesn't matter which party you're going to vote for, but it's a question you need to ask yourself. Where is it going to have the biggest effect? And as Alex said, you're a big proportion of the electorate in Leeds North West. But what's most important is we pick up on something that was said by Alan along there. This election is not just about Europe. That's very important. We're opposed to Brexit. We're in favour of a ratification referendum on any deal that comes forward. But it's about more than that. Because what the manifesto agreement that you get in an election does is it gives that government permission to do what it wants. And what we've seen under the Conservatives is the pursuit of austerity. We've seen the privatisation and cutbacks in the health service. We've seen the reduction in the police. We've seen the reduction in the fire service. And the policies for this government that's been cut a little short were to continue those trends. All of those things will be in the Conservative manifesto. So we're not just voting about Europe, which is obviously one of the things that the leader of the Conservative Party seems to be focusing on.
That's your time, Martin.
But it will involve voting on all those other things as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we've heard our opening speeches from the candidates here with us this evening. We're going to have a round of yes or no quick-fire questions. First of all, I just want to check, is everyone happy to have their photo taken? You don't need to show me, but if you're not, just raise your hand and the photographers here will make sure that your photo is not publicised on any social media, etc., in any public forum. So first up, we're coming to Alan first here. We've got a question from Jack Walker, a student who wants to know your views on fox hunting. In short, fox hunting, yes or no?
No.
Greg?
No, absolutely.
Certainly not.
Absolutely not.
Okay. University education, coming to you here first, Greg. Should students pay, yes or no?
No, as little as possible.
No.
No, and we're committing to that.
Students, no. Graduates, yes.
Thank you. The legalisation of cannabis, coming to Martin here first, yes or no?
It's been our long-term policy.
No.
No.
I believe we should have a review and take the scientific decision.
Thank you. And finally, we've been hearing a lot about whether or not the votes of young people are important to different parties. I'd like to ask you, coming to Alex again here first, do you think students are properly addressed or represented by the literature for your party as we approach this general election?
Of our party?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll try and make sure it is, yes.
Yes, we've just delivered a specific leaflet to Headingley. I think it's gone out just about everywhere.
I think we've covered most of Headingley, but we're trying to do so at the moment. We're just shorter of people and money than some of the others.
Thank you. Okay, so our first topic tonight is living in Leeds. In the run-up to our last general election a couple of years ago, 39% of students in Leeds highlighted the affordability of rent as a major concern. Other problems included the cost of transport and high crime rates within popular student areas, whilst recently we've also been hearing a lot about glass recycling in certain student areas. So first of all, coming to Alan here, how do you think that you could make sure that locals feel safe and students feel welcome in student-heavy residential areas? So you've got 1 minute.
Okay, so how do we make students feel safe? Number one, the built environment is very important, and our planning system doesn't necessarily help us. I think it's a complicated and very dry area, but looking at planning and how we make the environment better and safer and feel safer, we've made great progress, and there's some great buildings for students in the city, but there's still a lot more we can do. We also need to make sure our police are properly resourced. It's incredibly frustrating that the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner has sat on reserves for the last 3 years of £103 million, while seeing the numbers of police and PCSOs fall. Much more pressure should be put upon him to address that. And I think then we also have to look at how we have other types of support in evenings, in the late night economy, to make sure that students feel safe and there's places and people they can go to for help if they need it.
Thank you. Greg, so the same question, how do you make locals feel safe and students feel welcome?
Well, I suppose I've got a slight advantage on this one, having been the MP for 12 years and a councillor in Headingley for 2 years before that. So I've been involved in a lot of initiatives to do precisely those two things that are very, very important. One thing I am very pleased to say is that over the course of the last 12 years, I've seen real improvements in the integration of students into the community in Headingley, and I pay tribute to the work of the unions, the student unions and the universities and residents groups, and I think some of the volunteering partnerships that have been are really, really inspiring, and it's been great to see those. I think there's a better balance now in communities in Headingley and a better understanding I was very happy to support the knowledge programme and work with the police, the unions and universities. And we need to do more of that to make students aware of how they can keep themselves as safe as possible. Have the council and police involved too.
Thank you, Greg. Sorry about the noise. Martin, over to you.
One of the major issues that's affecting students, I have both my children are either ex-students or current students, so I know it's a familiar one, is to do with housing. And the quality and condition of properties and the rents that are being charged on them. And that's part of a bigger issue which we may address later in relation to housing and house construction and the needs for it, but also in terms of the subsidies being given to the private rented sector and the lack of rent controls in the private rented sector. One of the big improvements we've seen is the building of specific student accommodation on brownfield sites, particularly along Meanwood Valley and the Kirkstall Valley as well. That's an improvement in terms of the quality of student housing available. It also frees up properties that have been in multiple occupation for family occupation. And it's part of bringing that balance back into the community. If we were to go back, say, 20 years in the area, there were whole streets that were essentially just students. You would go along them with an electoral register, and there would be no one there registered to vote. Why it's so important for you lot to register. That is shifting, and that's very important, because what we want are for students to be able to live in communities, and communities provide a balance of the types of people living there, that have young children running around and have the space for them. So yes.
Thank you. Alex.
I work for the University of Leeds and Leeds Beckett University as the first community relations officer. I set up the neighbourhood helpline where local residents can ring if there's an issue. If they live in Headingley, I worked on the first student changeover where we support students in terms of things like recycling on July the 1st and the changeover day. And I've also been on the board of Unipol, working on the landlord register and around to-let signs, which are much less of an issue now than they were there. So I'd say that a lot of work's been done by the university, by the student unions, and by the council. And what I would say actually is that student housing, the quality of student housing is an issue. We don't have a national landlord register. Registers are not necessarily fit and proper people to be landlords. Labour government will bring that in. And also decency standards. So decency standards brought in for other sorts of housing, but not for private rented sector. And that's something in our manifesto. I think it's very important that we're going to bring that in. The other thing around police and community safety and crime is that, unfortunately, nationally, we've lost 20,000 police in the last 7 years. We're committed to bringing 10,000 of those back. And we've kept every PCSO in Leeds City Council, and the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner patrolling our streets, even though we have suffered huge cuts.
Thank you. So our next question comes from a student called Kim D, and the question coming to Greg here first is, what do you and your party propose to do about the dearth of domestic violence support services in Yorkshire?
Well, that's an extremely important issue and one that I'm very passionate about. I have been, until the dissolution of Parliament, a co-chair of the White Ribbon Group, which is a campaign many of you will know of men against violence against women. And I certainly share the dismay at the cuts there have been to vital services. I've been involved in some of those campaigns myself, and I think that clearly we need proper funding, and I think it's right that this should be an election issue, and not just here. I think this needs to be an election issue throughout the constituency, because it was actually in Ockley where one of the campaigns to save funding for a vital service was. So it's an issue everywhere, whether it's known about or not, and I'm certainly very happy to campaign cross-party to ensure that these services get the proper funding that they need.
Thank you. Martin.
The organisation that Greg's referred to is one that I think I was working for. And those organisations, and there's a range of them, provide support and advice to a lot of people who can't get that help elsewhere, who haven't got access to legal services. And it's very important that that provision is available, that level of support for people who can't otherwise access it, who know they can just walk in off the street and access it at a particular point without dealing with a professional, without dealing with the services they have to deal with. And that requires financial support. And the financial support for a lot of the support services comes from local councils. And what we have to recognise is that as the cuts affect them, the cuts brought in by the last couple of governments, they are cutting back on those services because they're seen as relatively soft money.
10 seconds.
And it's very important that council funding is maintained so that those services can be supported because it's a long-term saving.
Thank you, Martin. Alex, over to you.
Leeds didn't have a rape crisis for a number of years. I worked with people to help set up Sarsfield, which is the new service in Leeds, and I do support them financially as well. And that's hugely important that we have this infrastructure ecosystem support for people who are suffering domestic violence, sexual assault. And what I do absolutely agree with Martin, I work in the charitable sector. The charitable sector has been decimated by cuts from central government and affected by the cuts to local government because local government cannot support them in the way they used to be able to because they've been cut. And the whole infrastructure is in that sector. It's independent of the state, and the state needs to fund it properly because it's very hard to run those organisations on charitable grants, on donations, on fundraising.
Thank you. And to Alan.
Thank you. Domestic violence is one of the biggest issues and hidden issues that faces our communities. It's not a respecter of postcodes, it's not a respecter of how much money you have, it's not a respecter of particular faiths or genders. It affects every single community up and down the country, and the costs to people's lives every day are enormous. There's a lot more to do. Like Greg, it's one of those issues that really the politics needs to be taken out of as much as possible. Services need to be funded properly, but one of the big things that we need to do, and something we've done and we're working hard on in the area I represent, is to make sure that professionals in all settings are trained to recognise signs of domestic violence and are trained with what to do and where to signpost people to make sure they can get the support and help that they need. It's incredibly difficult because often the victims don't see themselves as victims initially, and it's a real tough challenge, but it is something we have to put an awful lot more effort into, and it can't just be down to one part of the government. It's got to be all parts that are trying to address it.
That's time. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to open up questions to the floor now. We'll come to you with a roaming mic, so if you'd just like to raise your hand if you have a question, anything to do with living in Leeds. We've got a question here. Sorry, it's very bright on the stage. I will try and spot everyone.
Thanks. Hi.
Okay, could we have the roaming mic up, please?
Hi there. Thank you very much. Can any of the candidates persuade some of us who might be considering voting in another home constituency why we should vote in Leeds? Should we be voting on maybe student issues or local, maybe parochial issues? Is there any reason why we should vote here as opposed to our homes where we may live, the majority of the rest of the year? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Martin, come to you.
What was it?
So, the question is about persuading students to vote here in Leeds rather than their constituencies at home.
I think that's one of the things I began to address in what I was saying. I think it's up for each individual student to assess according to their views where it's going to be of most value. That if you're living in a constituency that, let's say, is a marginal Labour one, and you're thinking of voting Labour, then perhaps that's the one you should be looking at. The same with the Liberal Democrats. If you live in Brighton Pavilion, you should be voting Green for Carlisle down there. And perhaps the same if you're in Bristol West or in Sheffield Central. It's a matter of looking at where your vote is actually going to be most effective, because what's most important in this election is trying to prevent a Tory majority, because there is so much that is going to be bad for everybody if that happens.
Thank you. Alex.
I think I'm going to take some advice here from the University of Leeds. He sent an email out, I think it was yesterday or the day before, encouraging students to register to vote. But he also included a link. I'm sure everybody here is a University of Leeds student got this email, to a website. And the website, you put in your postcode at home and your postcode in Leeds, and it would tell you where your vote would have the most effect in terms of marginality of the seat. So I would, recommend students to look at Alan's email and to see where their vote would be worth the most. Because some seats effectively haven't changed in a century, and they're very large majorities. This seat, I'm sure Greg will say the same, has been 3 different parties in the last 20 years. It's been Conservative, it's been Labour, it's been Liberal Democrat. This is not a seat that stays the same. This is a seat that tends to change. So I'd say if you've got a seat like that at home, weigh that up. But if you haven't, then you should vote in Leeds North West.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. Well, I don't think it's for any of us to tell you where you should vote or who you should vote for. That's your decision to make. And you're voting for someone to represent you in Parliament, and you should vote for the person that you want to represent you, whether it's here or whether it's at home or whichever you consider to be your home. That's down to you. It's a fantastic position that we're in. It's incredible that in this day and age there are still people in the world that don't have the privilege that we're all about to have. And don't forget that wherever you vote, whichever constituency, I can't think of very many, if any at all, where if everyone who didn't vote in the last election did in any constituency, they could change the result. So don't let people tell you you should look at what's most marginal. You should take the decision based on what you believe and who you think is the best person to represent you.
Thank you. Greg.
I think it's a very intelligent question, and I hope it's one that people are weighing up. And I think one wider point, and something that I have been calling to change, is it does annoy me when people say, oh, students don't vote and the turnout is really low, when actually a significant number of those people have voted in the election, but just were registered in 2 places. And somehow we need to address that so we get away from some of the myths around so-called student apathy. But I think absolutely, I probably agree, I think, with all the candidates. You look to see where your vote will count, the kind of MP that you want and what kind of outcome you want overall. I also think if you're going to be here for the next few years, if you're a first year, then I think vote here because you're going to be part of this community. If, however, you're on the verge of leaving, you might then choose, if you're going to move back home or somewhere else, to vote there. But make a decision, look at the options and vote, and make sure that your vote counts for what you want to do with it.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, so other questions from the floor. Our topic at the moment is living in Leeds. Yep, there's a hand over there.
Hi. So you've talked a lot about kind of tactical voting and where students should vote. I was just wondering on each of your individual stance, like what your stance is for maybe bringing in a system of proportional representation that might better represent us, and how you justify your position.
Thank you. So we're coming to Alex first for this one about implementing a system of proportional representation.
I mean, I'm a member of the Labour campaign for electoral reform. I've always been a supporter of a more proportional system. When we had the referendum, people probably forgotten it already, in 2011, to move to an alternative vote, which wasn't a proportional system, but was a step in the right direction. I was the national head of field operations for Labour, Yes to AV. So I'm a strong proponent of electoral reform, moving to more proportional representation. I don't think it is fair that so many votes don't really count in terms of the proportion of representatives that are in Parliament. And, I'm from one of the big parties, that this would effectively reduce our representation if we move from first past the post to a more proportional system. But I do support it because it's the best and fairest way to decide.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll start by stressing this is my personal opinion. I think we should have a change to the system. I think it's really important that we keep the link between an elector and their member of Parliament. So I'd like to see the first past the post system retained, perhaps say, for example, reduce the number of constituencies to 500, so that then you could have a proportional top-up list from a party list system, which would mean every vote counted everywhere. You'd have 2 votes, one for your local MP and one for a party nationally. And that would mean you voted for the person who's going to represent you, that you can lobby, and you'd also know that you are having an impact on what was happening in the national picture. So that would be my personal view. I doubt very much it's going to be in the Conservative manifesto tomorrow, but if you vote for me, then I will certainly be campaigning for a change such as that.
Thank you. Greg.
I think that's a great question, and I think this election is about to show precisely why we urgently need a reform to the voting system in England and Wales, and in Scotland, because I'm afraid it's fairly clear that we're going to get a large Conservative majority, or a larger majority, fairly represented for the votes that they will get nationally, as will Liberal Democrats, as will potentially UKIP. They certainly were last time. And in the end, I think that breeds a sense of frustration, anger, even hopelessness. And the Conservative students are there, very much respect their views. But in the end, there are a majority of people in this country who don't want the Conservatives in, and yet that will not be reflected. That simply cannot happen. North of the border, with the SNP, who are utterly dominant without a large majority of the popular vote. It can't continue. If we want to encourage people to vote, we have to make votes count everywhere.
Thank you. Martin.
Obviously, we're in favour of PR. We've been in favour of PR for as long as the party has existed. So it's in itself isn't an issue. What we set out to try and do with this election was to try and push it a little way along that track by looking to run a single candidate for the non-Tory grouping in each constituency. We've stood aside in a number of seats. Lib-Dems have done in one in Yorkshire. But what we ran into was the complete intransigence of the Central Labour Party and the Regional Liberal Democrat Party, that they didn't want to be talking about alliances. They would rather that there were three parties out there vying for those people who don't want to vote Conservative. Now, we can't presume that if someone doesn't have a Green candidate, they're going to vote for the Labour candidate that's there. But we might increase the chances of electing someone who wasn't a Conservative if we'd followed such a track. And it's a disappointment that we didn't begin to move along that track at this election in a firmer way.
Thank you. And Alex. Oh, sorry. You want something?
I can answer it twice.
Sorry, Alex. Okay, so moving on, our next category this evening is Brexit. So with 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting to remain, many students are wondering who will get the best deal for them now that Article 50 has been triggered. So our first question this evening is, what will you do to ensure the best Brexit deal for students, especially in regards to protecting the Erasmus programme, which is an invaluable opportunity for those who study languages? So Alan, coming to you first now.
Thank you. Well, I guess we start off by saying what we did in the referendum. I voted Remain. I'm disappointed somewhat that we're leaving the European Union, but we are. The decision is made. I think it's madness to think we can, and frankly offensive to a lot of people, to say we should keep voting until we have another go. The decision has been made. It would be absolutely chaotic to do what the Liberal Democrats are suggesting and in 2 years' time have another referendum. Imagine if people didn't like the deal at that point and said no. Then we have another 2 years of negotiations and presumably we'd have another referendum. At some point you have to make a decision, and the British people have spoken. What the Liberal Democrats effectively trying to say is that people were too stupid to know what they were doing. I reject that completely. I think they knew exactly what they were voting for, and the biggest majority and the biggest number of people in this country voted for anything that ever have. It's about who we have around the negotiating table. There's no question in my mind I would take Theresa May over Jeremy Corbyn all day long.
Thank you. Greg.
Well, it's all very well saying that the country voted and, that's the end of the matter, but it clearly isn't the end of the matter. The reality is that we are now in the process of starting the negotiations, which of course have been cynically held up by Theresa May deciding to call an election actually nothing to do with Brexit or strengthening her hand, actually because Jeremy Corbyn's leader of the Labour Party and she thought she could take some seats, which is a shameful reason to call a general election at a time like this. But in reality, people have to accept that it was a close result. And what we need to do, and it's all very well Alan saying that, but Theresa May saying we're trying to unite the country, and yet she's doing the complete opposite. I think it's perfectly sensible when we get to the reality of what it means to leave the European Union on the basis of the negotiations that happen, to ask people if they actually like what is on the table. Because it was a simple vote, are we going to come out or stay in? When we get to the reality, people should have another look at it. And I believe if it was right to ask people in the first place, it's right to ask people and give them a say on those terms.
Thank you. Martin.
I worked actively on the Remain campaign. I was doing hustings and public meetings for the Remain campaign. Green Party voters provided the biggest Remain vote amongst all of the parties, at almost 80%. We're very strongly committed to many of the things that Europe has to offer. We're strongly committed to democracy as well. And I think it's very odd when someone says that having a second vote is in some way undemocratic. We're strongly in favour of having what's called a ratification referendum. And to get around the problem that was mentioned there, Remain would be one of the options on that. In other words, we've changed our mind. Give people that chance. Because over that time, they will have found out a lot of things about the changes that are being proposed, should it actually come back in 2 years, which is unlikely. So, strongly in favour of negotiating as soft a Brexit as possible, but very important that there's a referendum on the result that's obtained, because people might not like what they see right then.
Thank you. Alex?
I'm a proud pro-European. I led the Labour Remain campaign across the whole of the north of Leeds. We had our own branch in the Labour Party, and Leeds North West voted very heavily to remain in the EU. And I think, first of all, we triggered Article 50 too early. I would have voted to block the triggering of Article 50, mainly because we didn't get the safeguards that we needed. Things we were promising in the referendum campaign, actually, by people like Michael Gove, that we'd retain that single market, that the rights of EU citizens wouldn't be affected. Those amendments were put down, they were voted down by the Conservatives, and so I would have voted to block them, unlike Greg, who didn't vote on the Article 50 vote, which is a constituent I'm disappointed by, because it was very clear, well over 65% of people in our constituency voted to remain. Going forward, I think that we have to put a lot of pressure on those things, on keeping access single market. That's the single most important thing, otherwise our economy is going to go down a hole if we don't retain access single market.
Thank you. So our next question is about what is your priority issue in the Brexit negotiations. So what will you do to protect people's right to free movement, or will you want to stay in the free market and so forth? So Greg, coming to you here first.
Okay, thank you. I have to say, Alex didn't answer the question at all last time and didn't say whether he supports a referendum on the terms or not, so it'd be interesting to find out if he does. He also didn't say how disappointed he must also be with Jeremy Corbyn and the vast majority of Labour MPs who voted with the Conservatives for triggering Article 50, which is something I wouldn't have considered doing. But the reason that I said, and I made a commitment last September, that I would not block the start of the negotiations was because there was a referendum. But that's also why I think now, after the process of negotiation, we can have another one. So that's my position, and that's entirely consistent. So I think it's actually the Labour Party who are confused over that one. But in the end, British business need access to the single market. That's absolutely key. Big business, medium-sized business, small business are saying that.
10 seconds.
In terms of student issues, I am campaigning already for the Erasmus scheme. That's something that would be very damaging to this country, and Euratom as well. But we need to retain a close relationship with Europe going forward. That's absolutely key, and that should be the tone of the negotiations.
Thank you. Martin?
It's the whole group of things that we can do more effectively within a larger grouping. The single market's part of it, but it's very much tied into the globalisation system. There's always been a lot of green cynicism and uncertainty about the economic underpinnings of the European community. And yet we're internationalists. We're in favour of all those things that bring people together, in terms of bringing students together, whether it's at school level or universities, that allows that freedom of movement, of residence in different places, that movement to work. So all of those are good, strong, positive things that we would want to retain. There's a whole raft of legislation that has come into this country that wouldn't have been here otherwise. Environmental legislation, a lot of the action in relation to climate change. And it's very important that those are protected in any Brexit deal that goes ahead, but they're part of our reason for arguing very strongly that we would be much better off inside the European Union.
Thank you. Alex?
Well, I think going forward, the most important priorities are those things, that retain membership of the customs union, retain membership of the single market, that we actually safeguard rights of UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK. I think those should be the absolute priorities for the negotiations, because we're going to have these 2 years of negotiations now. That is the period we're in. And if you look at the 9 amendments that the Labour Party put down before the vote on Article 50, all of those are covered, as well as being open and transparent with the British people about what's going on, rather than having a behind closed doors negotiation.
Thank you. And Alan?
Okay, so I think the most important thing is deciding what our relationship is going to be with Europe and the European Union in the future. We may be leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. They are still trading partners. They are still business partners. They're not going away, and we're not going away from them. There has to come a point in time where you decide that the decision has been made, and the decision has been made. And now it's about thinking, what does the future look like? How are we going to deal with relations? How are we going to deal with students? I think this city, of all cities in the country, can celebrate massively the contribution that people from all over the world have made to come and live and work here and make their lives here, to study here. They've contributed massively to this city, and I would hate to see anything that put that at risk. And it's time, I think, and as I said before, the decision is simple at the election. Do we have Theresa May negotiating with the European Union and the 27 member states, or Jeremy Corbyn, with all of the other people that have openly admitted they will do everything they possibly can to disrupt those negotiations and make them as chaotic as possible?
Thank you. So I'd now like to open this to the floor. So if you would like to raise your hand, we'll get a room mic to you if you have a question surrounding Brexit. Got one in the front row here.
Thank you. You've all spoken a lot about our new relationship with Europe. I wonder what your position is on the sort of approach we should be having with countries outside of the EU, and what our relationship should be with the wider world now that we have the freedom to make those choices from now on.
Thank you. Martin, coming to you first here.
I think it's going to be very problematic. We've got our major trading partner just across a couple of seas, and there's a few other countries around the world that we trade with significantly. But we aren't a large part of their trade. We aren't important to them. They're a lot further away. So we have to recognise that that major trading relationship is going to remain. In terms of actually setting up deals elsewhere, we're in a position where we'd be starting from nowhere. And it's very difficult to organise and negotiate trade agreements. The European Union itself has shown that with the length of time it's been negotiating with Canada about an agreement. And we can't expect to be managing it very much quicker than that. So for a long time we'll be trading on terms that will be disadvantageous to a lot of our firms, both in terms of exports and the import of the materials that they need. So it's not an encouraging picture. Obviously, if it goes ahead, we must be doing all that we can.
That's time,
But the
Martin.
most important thing is to maintain the European connection as much as we can.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that the Labour Party is an internationalist party. It's an outward-looking party. And I can also say there's a lot of criticism of Jeremy Corbyn here, but I can tell you one thing, Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't hold hands with Donald Trump. I was at the Paris climate change negotiations on behalf of the city. I'm the lead for climate change on Leeds City Council. And the Americans are looking now whether they're going to come out of that negotiation, of that treaty, renege on the Paris climate change treaty. If we leave the EU, then we'll have that opportunity. And I'm concerned that our political closeness, the current Prime Minister, if she's re-elected, with Donald Trump, might put at risk our position of being within that climate change treaty. If we don't stay within Paris, and the Americans don't stay, and the whole Paris climate change treaty starts to break down, the catastrophic nature of climate change will be wrought upon us all, and particularly of you, because you're going to be here longer than us.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. Brexit is a threat, but it's also an opportunity. One of the reasons I voted to remain was because of my fear of what would happen to the economy. But Brexit happened, and the world didn't end the next day. Things carried on. Actually, our economy has continued to grow. We've got record unemployment figures only today, and things are ticking along. We have to get a good relationship with Europe, but one of the reasons I think people voted to leave was because the European Union has become so big, so bureaucratic, so undemocratic, and so slow to do anything. And on our own, we have an opportunity to negotiate the world that have taken years and years and years. You look how long it's taken Canada to try and get a deal with the European Union. We can now start talking directly to those countries and make it easier for British businesses to work with those countries. So yes, there's a threat, but there's also a huge opportunity for us to get into markets that we haven't been involved in before.
Thank you. And Greg.
Thanks, Georgia. Well, I think it's a good question, and I think this is precisely existing. And I think that's also another reason why it's so cynical that Theresa May has called an election for purely party political reasons, rather than getting on with establishing our place in the world in these difficult and troubled times. I think it's vital that we have strong links around the world, as we already had, and indeed they were strengthened actually by being a member of the EU rather than the other way around. And of course our negotiating power was much greater, both in terms of world peace and in terms of economic negotiations. But the way to do it certainly is not the way Theresa May is doing it, which is going around rather desperately talking to countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Actually, if she's serious about us wanting to have a new place in a world, that is not the right way to do it. We need to stay an international, outward-looking nation, and I fear under this government that will not be the case.
That's time. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to invite another question from the floor about Brexit, if anyone has one. Yep, got a hand up here.
In relation to Brexit and the further freedom Britain would have if they were no longer in the EU, I want to know your opinions on Britain's role in the refugee crisis and in potential changes to the laws relating to the UK border.
Would you mind repeating that one more time? It's a little quiet here for us on stage.
In relation to Brexit and the further freedom Britain would have if they were no longer in the EU, what are your opinions on Britain's role in the refugee crisis and the potential changes to laws relating to the UK border?
Okay, thank you very much. So, Alex, we're coming to you first. Did you hear that? Okay,
yeah,
great.
Change the law on the UK border. Okay, I'm Jewish, and my grandparents were refugees. I feel very strongly about this issue. Just recently, we had the Dubs Amendment in Parliament about having unaccompanied Syrian minors come to this country. And unfortunately, after Theresa May took office, the government reneged on that, and we didn't get the numbers of unaccompanied minors coming here that we should have done. Leeds and Leeds City Council, Labour Leeds City Council, put in place arrangements to take those children in, and we have taken some children in, but not as many as we'd like, to protect those young innocent people who've been scarred by the war in Syria. So I'd like to see us be much stronger on these issues, particularly around child refugees and taking people in from the crisis in Syria and other places.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. I think we've got a very proud record in Leeds of doing more than our bit to take in refugees and provide them shelter and support and try and make them part of our city. One of the things that your question touches on is the thorny issue, which comes up a lot on the doorsteps of international aid. And I get tackled by it quite often, but I'm very proud that it was a Conservative government that got international aid to the 0.7% target, and I'm very proud that we're committing to stick with that in the next Parliament. Because one of the things that we need to do is to help people in their own countries, and our foreign policy and our place in the world is crucial to that, and trying to stop people needing to travel such long distances on such dangerous journeys to try and get a better life, that has got to be one of the top priorities for the next government. And as I say, I'm proud that we'll be sticking to that international aid commitment, and we can help people to live better lives where they are rather than having to make those horrible journeys and sacrifices.
That's time. Thank you. Greg.
I'm glad someone raised this. I'm certainly very proud of my party leader Tim Farron and the leading role he's played in raising this consistently. I think the reality is that, you know, at the time when we do leave the EU, if that is what happens and we don't get the chance to have a referendum on the terms of exit, then the idea that somehow there won't be any issues in terms of refugees is nonsense. In fact, actually, the predictions are that it will be more likely for people to be travelling to the UK directly, and certainly with the changing relationship with France and the moving of the border to Dover. So actually, I think people need to be aware of that. But we do need to take our responsibility. I got a very inspiring envelope through the door. Some of you may have got it from Christian Aid, saying proudly helping refugees since 1945, and that gives a clue. And that was something supported by all parties and by Winston Churchill at the time. I do think it's shameful that only 350 refugees of the 3,000 the government pledged to do have been brought in. That isn't good enough. And I want to see this country show the compassion that it has over the last 150 years and make that clearly a British value.
Thank you. Martin, coming to you now. If you wouldn't mind speaking up slightly, your mic is slightly lower apparently.
Sorry?
If you wouldn't mind speaking up slightly, that would be brilliant.
Oh, okay. My
Thank
apologies if I was... Clearly, we should be ashamed, really, as one of the richest countries in the world, of our record in relation to the recent refugee crisis. The closest country to Syria, Lebanon, has taken in 1 million for a population of 4 million. That would be the equivalent of us taking 15 million in. And they aren't as rich a nation as us. So we should put our taking of any refugees from that area in that context. It's unusual for me to agree on a point with the Conservative, but it's also very important to recognise that when people flee from their homes, whether it's for war or natural disaster, the most important thing is that they want to stay somewhere near where they've come from so they can go back as easily as possible. And thus, it's also important to have a second branch to it. Yes, we should be welcoming the refugees, but we should be providing support in those nearby countries to allow those people who want to return to stay there as well as possible under the best possible conditions.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next topic, which is education. So in discussing education, the government has just passed their higher education bill, which will allow universities to, among other things, raise their tuition fees according to the new bronze, silver and gold rating of the Teaching Excellence Framework. So with this in mind, our first question that a student has sent in beforehand is, are tuition fees now being used to try to buy the student vote? And Alan, we're coming to you here first.
Thank you. I think, yes, people are trying to buy the student vote with a policy that's nonsensical and undeliverable and just telling the audience what they want to hear. And it goes down very easily, I'm sure, particularly in this audience, to say, yep, we're going to get rid of tuition fees. But the simple, who is then going to pay for university education? Is it right that people who have never been to university and will never go to university have to pay for those that benefit? We effectively in this country have a graduate tax. So only those people who have been to university and have a job and have a good job that's paid over £21,000 pay anything back. If you don't go, if you don't earn £21,000, you never have to pay anything back. And yes, you come out with a large debt at the end of university, but it's not like the sort of debt that you have with a mortgage. So I think it's quite right to have the system that we have. It means universities are properly funded. They weren't under the last Labour government, who of course introduced tuition fees in the first place and then raised them despite pledging not to.
Thank you. Greg.
Well, I think one thing that people are pretty well aware of is that this is an area where politicians have let themselves down and let students down very badly over the years, and that actually is all the parties. I'm very proud that I kept to my own promise to vote against any rise in tuition fees, which I did and would continue to do so. But I remember in 2005, at my first hustings in this very room, the Labour candidate being criticised because Labour had introduced top-up fees despite saying they wouldn't. And at that time, the Conservatives, as well as the Liberal Democrats, were saying that there shouldn't be any increase in fees. I decided that the most realistic way to fund higher education is a graduate tax. That was when the NUS decided that was their policy. I think that is the fairest way of doing it, so that people don't pay at the time, they do pay back afterwards. And I think that is what I will continue to call for, because I think it's realistic, but we also very much want grants back for poorer students, and that's something that we will do and I will keep campaigning for.
Thank you. Martin.
I think the people that Alan referred to who resent paying for the education of others will probably change their minds when they go into a hospital and depend on those educated individuals, or when they send their children to school and want them to be taught by somebody, or when they want the past explained to them by somebody who's studied it. In other words, there is a value to education, and it was being recognised for a long time by a lot of people. I was the first from my family to go to university, but my grandparents, my parents saw it as an important thing that was done, an important thing that was supported. And I think that's one of the things we need to recognise. We need to look at what we actually want as a civilised society and decide to fund it. We can claim consistency. In 2005 we were against university tuition fees. in 2010, in 2015, and again, we're arguing for the abolition of tuition fees, introduction of maintenance grants, and the abolition of the debt.
10
Because
seconds.
it's the future that we need, and it's your future that we need to fuel my old age, really.
Thank you. And Alex.
Okay, I think the way that we should look at it is when I was here as a student executive, this was a free education student union, free education policy, and we talked about whether education should be a private good or a public good. I strongly believe it should be a public good. It is for the good of everybody to have a highly educated society, whether they themselves go to university or not, and for the opportunity to go to university at any time in their lives, because going to university at 18 isn't clearly the only time you go. So just to echo Martin's point, people need doctors, teachers, lawyers, other people who've gone through university to get through life. And the whole idea, the marketisation actually of the higher education system has changed universities. And what we've seen actually is staff-student ratios going down, but students paying more, and the quality issues and payment issues are going backwards. And I believe that abolishing fees and making higher education fully public good is the way to resolve it.
That's time. Thank you. Okay, so we've got some predetermined questions here, but I'm going to open the questions to the floor now. So if anyone has a question about education, then please just raise your hand. Okay, we've got one at the top there in the balcony.
Hi, you mentioned that, I think it was the Conservative candidate said that not everyone should have to pay this student tax or this graduate tax. What do you plan on doing to increase other ways into work? So like colleges, college courses and that sort of thing, and apprenticeships?
Okay, we're coming to Greg here first for this question.
I think that's a good question. I mean, clearly I don't agree with the Conservative position on this and have made that clear, but I do also think that there isn't enough attention on further education, and we have committed to increasing the funding opportunities for further education and to do more in terms of apprenticeships, which is something that we very much pushed whilst we were in government. In the end, I think this is about everyone having the same chance to make the best of themselves. And for some people that will be a degree at a university, an academic one. For some people it will be further education. For some people it may be going into apprenticeship. Some people it might be going into work or even self-employment at a young age. And I think we need to do much more to create that fairness for people to have those opportunities.
10 seconds.
And I'm very pleased that we are doing that, as well as committing considerable extra funding for education, whereas I'm afraid the Conservatives are wasting £9 billion on free schools and the ideological instruction of grammar schools, which will not do the things that I have said that I think we need to do.
Thank you, Martin.
Could you clarify what the question was?
Yeah, the question was asking about what we should do for other forms of further education for employability, I think, like colleges, etc. Is that correct? Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
I picked up something slightly different, so thank you
Sure.
for that. Again, we're committed to offering that range of opportunities. I worked for a while in FE, and there were a great number of people in there who were pursuing courses that were going to take them into various types of employment. They were going to be butchers, they were going to be working in garages, they were training as mechanics. And that's a section that has consistently lost its funding over the last couple of decades. And FE colleges have closed, they've become focused in on particularly examination type subjects because university has been seen much too much as the end point. Apprenticeships also, it needs to be recognised that a lot of apprenticeships have been taken up by older people rather than the younger ones that they should be aimed at. So our policy would be to aim apprenticeships much more at younger people, to increase funding for FE and the types of courses being run in FE, because those are very important as well. And it's that support for those wanting to pursue alternative paths in employment that is very important.
Thank you. Alex.
I think just to echo Martin, FE funding has degraded even more than HE funding. And looking at vocational training courses, they've been reduced, consistently. So we need to have a reinflation, really, of the FE sector. If you look at the colleges in this city, that they've undergone a real squeeze around staff and facilities. And that's something that we need to change. Also, around apprenticeships, the apprenticeship wage is a different level of minimum wage, and it is effectively poverty pay, and that should be changed. We need apprenticeships viewed as real jobs with real pay. And the same also in terms of a lot of jobs now, the route in is through internships. Internships are not regulated. You can go and work for nothing, unpaid internships, and that's not fair. That means you can only afford to do it if you have got the money. So that will be banned under a Labour government, and they'll have to be paid.
Thank you. And Alan.
Thank you. Quickly again on tuition fees, just to touch on the Labour policy, which is, am I on?
Can you turn the mic up slightly, please?
The Labour policy is effectively to make the rich richer. Under the current policy, anybody can go to university, and it doesn't matter what your background or how much money you've got. And it's really important, and that's one of the reasons why the number of people going to university has gone up, because you don't have to pay up front. With regard to the question that you asked, apprenticeships are really important. I run a small pub and restaurant business. Clearly, it would be inappropriate to mention the Fox and Hounds at Walton while I'm up here and giving a plug. But I'm very proud to employ apprentices, and one of the things that we need to do is to pay them properly, to make sure they have proper jobs. There are too many people employing apprenticeships, like unpaid internships, who are really taking advantage and getting cheap labour. And that's one of the things I would really campaign hard on. And my colleague Alex Shelbrooke, who's the MP for Elmit, is the single parliamentarian who's done the most around unpaid internships. So I'm sorry, I can't let Labour have that one all to themselves, because it's the Conservatives that are pushing hard on that. Where people have those opportunities, we should pay them properly for them.
Thank you. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our next topic, health, which we'll probably spend the rest of the time discussing. So turning now to health, many students have concerns about the future of the NHS, as well as local provision for mental health support, since 1 in 4 people are experiencing mental health problems, and being a student can come with a great deal of pressure. So we've got a question here from a student. It says, students currently suffer as we're only allowed to register at 1 GP surgery at a time, meaning we have no consistency of care in and out of term time. How will your party improve healthcare for students? And Martin, I'm coming to you first here.
On that specific issue, if that's the point, then it is a matter of making that available. I've actually looked through our health policies again. I don't often look at our policies. I tend to make things up as I go along, based on experience. But that one wasn't in there as a specific item, so I can't claim to be able to answer that question. But it does seem like an obvious anomaly. On the provision of mental health services, which is, I think, one of the significant underfunded sectors, we need to recognise that mental health issues are going to affect a lot of us. They're going to affect us in ways that are involved with studying, with working outside. And there's a lot of lost time in relation to mental health, and there is underfunding of mental health services within the NHS. But behind all that is the overall issue of the underfunding of the NHS and the privatisation of parts of the NHS. And those are things that need to be addressed as priorities by any non-Conservative government. We need to be looking at reinstating the NHS as it was and repealing the act that allows the privatisations to go ahead.
Thank you.
Also, my microphone's broken, which is probably why you can't hear me.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. So, Alex, on to you next.
Just about GP practices, that's not a new problem. The same with dentistry. I was at the student medical practice here, and I was at the dentist on Woodhouse Lane. And then when I graduated, then moving on the GP service, once about the dentistry, I got lost in the system for quite a long time. So it's not a new problem, and absolutely we should do something about that so that people can register in more than one place. Like registering to vote, you should be able to register in both your home and your university medical and dental practices, and I think that's something that I would campaign on. There isn't a specific pledge on that in the Labour manifesto, but that's something we can look at. In terms of the NHS as a whole, I think everybody knows the NHS, in real terms, because I know somebody else will say something different, in real terms, has lost a huge amount of funding, and we're seeing waiting lists grow, and we're seeing staffing levels reduce, unsafe staffing levels on some wards, and Labour will reintroduce the safe staffing levels and reduce waiting lists.
Thank you. Alan.
You would think this would be a relatively simple problem to fix, that just simply allowing people to register in more than one place should be an obvious solution. The problem comes to funding, because the way GP funding works, wherever you register, they get an amount of money every year to look after you. So we have to find a way to make that money follow the person. And it doesn't seem ridiculous that if you're a student or in any other circumstances, lots of people who live in one place and work somewhere else during the week, why can't we have a system that we can split that pot and you can register in 2 or 3 places if that's what suits your lifestyle? So that seems an obvious thing to do, and if elected, that's something I'd take on. The thing I'd say more generally about healthcare, it's not all about money. You can put a penny on income tax to increase the amount of money, but what do you do when that's not enough? Because it won't be. You can keep putting more and more and more money into the health service. And the first thing, I hope there's more questions on it, we should be incredibly proud. And the thing that makes me angry most about the health service is people that have chosen to weaponise it.
That's time.
90% of people get a really good experience in the health service. We should be very proud of the doctors and nurses that we have. There's a lot more to do, but I think our health service is great and we should fight to protect it.
Thank you. And Greg. Greg.
Thanks, Georgia. Well, I'm very pleased to be talking about the NHS, and I hope that that will increasingly be a key, if not the key issue of the election, because the truth is, as opposed to the rhetoric and the spin, is that the NHS, and also particularly social care, particularly for older people, is in crisis. It is something that hasn't been properly addressed by governments, and indeed on the social care side, when the coalition had introduced finally a cap on the amount of money that people will pay for care in later life, one of the things that the Conservative government did when it came in was to kick that into the long grass, which was absolutely disgraceful. The student registration problem should clearly be solved in the same way that the student registration for voting should be solved. It can't be beyond the wit of people to do that. I certainly am very happy to campaign for that. I'm delighted that we are making the NHS very much central to our manifesto, including parity for mental health, to ensure that people who need treatment, who need to go and see someone, get that treatment. But we're also saying very proudly that we think it's time to put a penny on income tax to properly fund the NHS and move towards having an NHS tax. Because if we don't want to go down the route of having a private insurance system, it's time that we acknowledged it needs funding, it needs ring-fenced funding and separate funding.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one audience question now, please, on the topic of health. That's all we've got time for. So do we have any questions? If not, I've got one up here. Is that a hand? No. There's a hand.
Hi. So my question's about mental health. So obviously we've heard the 1 in 4 statistic. We also know that suicide is the leading cause of death in under 30s in this country. So how are you going to make sure that mental health, A, remains at the top of the agenda, but that funding is also, because I know the Conservative Party released their kind of what they wanted to do about mental health, but there was no real mention of how the funding was going to work. So how are you actually going to ensure that the funding ends up going to the mental health services?
Thank you. So Alex, we're coming to you first for this question.
I've got some experience in this area, and I think that it's a complex area. People need different solutions for different mental health issues, and we need a much broader, service. 1 in 4 people will suffer mental health issues through their life. First of all, our mental health budgets aren't ring-fenced currently, and Labour will commit to ring-fencing mental health budgets. And mental health can start very early in life as well. And we don't have mental health services in schools, and Labour will commit to creating mental health services in secondary schools. I mean, our manifesto doesn't say that we'll create mental health services specifically to universities, but I would campaign for that as well, and I'm sure that's something that the Labour Party would be supportive of if we entered office. So I think that we need to have specific services targeted at people, particularly young people, around mental health, and we're going to ring-fence a budget to create that.
Thank you. Alan.
Probably one of the most difficult and upsetting and rewarding parts of being elected in any position, in my case a councillor, I'm sure the others on the panel will agree, is when people with mental health problems come to you for help. And I've been in situations where in the small hours of the morning I've been trying to support local people with very, very challenging circumstances. One of the things that we could and should do, and I've been lobbying for some time, is to change the arrangements we have in local councils and change the law to mean that young people stay in the care of children's services much longer. One of the big problems I've encountered is young people who get to 18 years old in very vulnerable positions that fall off a cliff edge and get lost in the adult services world. and it's time that we change the law so that children's services are legally required to take responsibility for young people up to the age, in my opinion, of 25, 30, because the services are much more geared up to support them and hold their hands to go from childhood through their teenage years and into adulthood.
Thank you. Greg.
Well, I'm delighted that someone has mentioned mental health, and I think that is so crucial. It's raised throughout this election campaign. I, through a heartbreaking constituency experience, became a vice chair of the parliamentary group on suicide prevention. I also am currently working with the inspirational rugby league charity State of Mind, which is raising awareness of mental health issues with sportsmen, in this case rugby league players and rugby union players, speaking out about their own mental health issues. It's great that we're now talking about it, but we still have a long way to go in terms of that parity, and that's what we must aim for. Nothing less will do, and that means parity for waiting times, which is what we're committing to, parity for funding. And in terms of young people, ensuring that no young person who is suffering from depression or any other form of mental health issues gets to see someone within a maximum 6-week period. That is crucial. So I'm glad we're talking about it. Let's keep this on the agenda until we get that parity that I think we'd all agree should be there.
Thank you. And Martin.
It does require a massive shift in funding towards mental health care. If we look at the severe end, the sharp end, when an incident actually happens, the first responder is very often the police, because there aren't the emergency mental health services there available. A recourse is very often spending a night in a police cell rather than in a specialised hospital available for those offering those mental health places. So when there is severe incidents or episodes, those are being dealt with in a way that anybody else in the health service would not be dealt with. They're being dealt with through our criminal services, in effect. And that's, in many ways, linked to the way in which mental health problems have been perceived for a long time, and the way in which those suffering with mental health problems were perceived. So it needs a massive shift of funding within the increase in funding to the NHS to ensure that those services are available, the mental health beds are available, and that the mental health emergency services, as well as the support services, before they get there.
Thank you. And finally, that's all we've got time for now, but we're going to have 1 minute closing statements from each of... Alex, have you spoken on that? You spoke first on that, didn't you? Thank you. We're going to start off with Alan to give a closing statement. So if you'd like to say why you think students should vote for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for hosting such a great debate. I'm bound to say, as part of the contract of standing, that obviously the choice at the election is from strong and stable leadership under Theresa May, or, as we've seen, particularly from Martin, a coalition of chaos. That would be the alternative. But the most important thing is to come back to what I said at the beginning. This is a real privilege that all of us have, that people have fought and died for, to be able to go and vote in an election. And with a small stubby pencil and a piece of paper in a village hall or community centre, you can go and change the world with one stroke of that pencil. And whoever you vote for, I hope it's for me, but most importantly, I hope every single person in this room casts their vote in that election. Thank you.
Thank you. Greg, if you'd like to give your closing remarks.
Thank you. Well, once again, thank you to you, Georgia, for chairing so well. Thank you to you all for coming. It was actually when I was studying politics, first of all, as a sixth former, and then at university, that I decided I wanted to be an MP. And I did it because I wanted to change society, this country, the world, for the better. That's still very much my driving force. I still have that passion to do that. I've shown that you can do it locally, and I've actually shown that you can make changes nationally. In this election, it is so important that you vote and that you have your say and that you debunk some of the nonsense and the myths about students not voting and not caring, because I know that isn't true from speaking to you on a regular basis. I just ask you to think who you want your MP to be, what kind of MP, someone who campaigns, who wants to change things, who is accessible, who listens, but also what kind of country you want this to be. And I want a fairer, better country, not the direction Theresa May's taking it in, but not the fantasy economics of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, a genuine, better, progressive way, an outward, open, tolerant Britain in an international world.
Martin.
It is so important. It's important that you actually think about where your views lie. There are a lot of websites out there that will ask you questions and position you on a political axis. And what we know is that when people are given policies blind, green policies are usually the ones that win. People would vote green, except they think green can't get elected. And that's self-fulfilling without proportional representation. What you need to do is to think about what it is that you actually want long-term, because that's what's got to guide the vote. What sort of world do you want to live in? What sort of society? What sort of things do you want people to be able to do? Are you favouring a health service and access to education over defence systems that are a waste of money? And so it's very important that you assess things in those terms and think about it long term rather than just the particular soundbite of this election.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alex, would you like to give your closing statement?
Thank you. I think it was a great privilege tonight, and I think it's worth reflecting actually on the last 7 years and thinking about how the country's changed. Whether, we've seen the NHS go backwards, we've seen class sizes increase and schools becoming underfunded. We've seen our transport system getting worse, but increased profits for private operators. Do you want a country where we reverse that, where we bring the railways back into public ownership, where we improve funding of higher education, but not putting the burden on you, where we're seeing smaller class size and better funded schools with all young children getting free school meals, and at the same time that the large corporations, the Amazons of this world, pay their fair share of corporation tax? Those largest companies have seen their corporation tax go through the floor. Highest earners have seen their tax take go down. That's the way we can reverse things. This is the choice you have. Do you want to see those things? Do you want to see the country move forwards, or do you want to see the country carry on in the direction it's carried on for the last 7 years?
Thank you. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of the candidates for giving up their time to be with us this evening. This whole event will be made available online, so you guys can share with your friends, get them to catch up at home, and I hope what you've heard this evening so far will enable you to make a more informed decision about who to vote for if you're in the Leeds North West constituency on June the 8th. For now, we're going to take a 15-minute interval before welcoming the candidates for Leeds Central, so please be back here just after 6:45. Thank you very much.
Martin, let's take some photos. Like, can you take some photos, or could somebody take some photos during? Likewise, very good. Ed, good.
I'm happy to take photos, but of course the union will be taking rather back the photos.
But it'd be good to be able to get one that I can just use and put on social media if they don't tonight. Just that.
Yeah, sure.
That'd be great. Thanks, John.
Certainly.
Yeah, please do, yeah. Be as intrusive as you do.
Now, we had a couple of problems with our microphones just in the first round, so we'd like to leave the packs out on the front of the table.
Okay.
The lead should be long enough that if you stand, it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
I'll just put on that for you.
Can you just remind me of your name?
Bill Palfreman.
And Palfreman.
During.
So you should be able to start.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Is everyone mic'd up? Brilliant. Okay, everybody, sorry about the short delay, just getting the tech all sorted. So welcome back to LUU's General Election Candidate Question Time. I'm now joined on the stage by the local candidates for Leeds Central, so thank you very much to everyone for coming this evening. Just again, my name's Georgia, I'm the forum facilitator here at LUU, and my role tonight is impartial to facilitate the questions and debate. So I'd like to welcome the candidates. So we've got Hilary Benn for Labour. For the Conservatives, we have Alan Lamb, who you may recognise from our last go. He's the candidate for Leeds North West, but he's standing in here for Gareth Davies, who's the central candidate for the party. So please welcome Alan. So for the Liberal Democrats, we have Andy Nash. For the Green Party, Ed Carlisle. And for UKIP, Bill Palfreman. So Leeds Central is another fairly student-heavy constituency, so by inviting the local candidates along this evening to respond directly to student concerns, we'll hopefully be able to make a more informed decision on the 8th of June. So again, we're obviously trying to keep to time this evening, give every candidate an equal chance to voice their views, and of course the debate will encompass a wide range of political stances, so I'd like to ask the audience to respect their views and the candidates to respect the views of each other. It's understandable you may want to applaud at certain points, but we won't be doing so after each answer in the interest of time, and cheering or booing would of course be inappropriate. We have students here with accessibility needs, so please be considerate of this. Also remember to put your mobile on silent, etc. So the way that tonight is going to work is that each candidate will have the opportunity to present a 2-minute opening speech, and when all of the candidates have finished their opening remarks, we will take some pre-chosen audience questions on the topics living in Leeds, Brexit, education, health, and we didn't get into environment last time, but we will try to get there this evening, or take some questions from the floor about environment towards the end. We're also taking questions on social media as well as from the floor, so feel free to tweet us at Leeds Union and use the hashtag GE17. Just make sure your questions are not candidate specific. As I've said, we want to let everyone have the chance to answer. So in a randomised order, the candidates will have 1 minute to answer each question, and I'll be giving them a 10 seconds reminder that they're coming near the end of their time. Towards the end of the debate, each candidate will also be able to make a 1-minute closing statement. So let's begin with the opening speeches, and I'm coming to Hilary here first. You've got 2 minutes.
Well, Georgia, thanks very much indeed. We face a very big choice in this election about the kind of values we want to uphold in our future as a country. 42% of children in this constituency grow up in poverty. The use of food banks is growing. People in the poorest parts of Leeds die on average 10 years earlier than people in the most well-off parts. The NHS is in real trouble. We have a social care crisis, and local schools are having their budgets cut. So Labour is committed to fund both the NHS and our schools properly, because we depend on the health service. And if we're going to be a successful economy in the future, we have to invest in our greatest resource, people. And that means more young people staying on in education, which is why we will restore the educational maintenance allowances, the student maintenance grant, and abolish tuition fees. I'm sorry to say the Conservatives' idea of progress is to go back to the 11+, to which I am wholly opposed. But we've also got to invest in our infrastructure. I put a video on Facebook earlier today about the problem of air quality in the centre of Leeds. Now, we need a new Clean Air Act, but you know what? We need a modern rapid transit system for our city. And I'm passionate about devolution of power to Leeds, because these are decisions that we ought to be taking for ourselves. Finally, I know we're going to touch on Brexit. The referendum decided the outcome. We're leaving, but it did not determine the terms on which we leave or the future of our relationship with our friends and neighbours. And I think that the Conservative government is taking a huge risk with the future of our economy, because the Prime Minister says she's prepared to walk away with no deal. What does no deal mean? It means the return of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, which business does not want, uncertainty about access for our services industry. 80% of our economy is services. It means that we would leave the Erasmus programme. Many students from Leeds have benefited from it. We'd leave the Horizon 2020 programme. And I think that would be bad for the country. We need to get the right deal for the future of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course you can. Of course you can.
Ed.
Yes. Sorry, Hilary's...
I'm trying to get
not a problem.
a reset. There you go.
Great, good evening. It's great to be back here at Leeds University Union. So my name's Ed Carlisle. I came to Leeds nearly 20 years ago to study at this university. I fell in love with the city on day one, and I'm still here. In the past 15 years, I've been involved in community development work across this city, and particularly in South Leeds, where I have lived and invested myself in the past 15 years. I've got really kind of involved in co-leading a whole bunch of community and youth programs down there. Until 2 years ago, I wasn't involved in formal politics. But 2 years ago, I joined the Green Party because I was passionate about people in my local constituency having an alternative to the same old politics. I've stood in 2 council elections, and now here I am standing in the parliamentary elections. And I'm still passionate about breaking up the same old politics, giving people a credible alternative. I guess I've got 2 headlines for now, and I'll get into details later. I guess number one, we need fresh ideas for, I suppose, our society in crisis, when so much is up in the air. People everywhere say they are fed up with the same old politics, the same old results. And indeed, if you step back, if you just kind of try to step back from our society, our economy, our culture, we live in a mad time, a hugely unjust economy stacked against the majority, groaning education, health and other systems, wrecking the planet. Successive governments have failed to tackle these big issues. And secondly, we need to rebuild power in our communities. That's what I've been doing in the last 15 years. That's what will give us resilience to face whatever storms come our way. We need to break the mould of politics being dominated by a relatively small elite of people making the decisions about our society. We need fresh blood to make the decisions that shape our country. It's great to be back here tonight. There is an alternative to the same old. We can choose a different path. We can create a different society. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil.
Hello, I'm Bill Palfreman. I'm the UKIP candidate. The reason that I became involved in UKIP and politics in general is because of my extreme and growing alarm with the political direction the country was taking, particularly since 2000. Particularly the issue of ever-expanding state power and ever-expanding taxation and ever-growing influence of a class of people who fill the organs of the state and the secondary institutions. My concern is that this has been very detrimental to individual liberty in this country, and I feel that the best way of pushing things back towards a commerce-based society rather than that of a socialist control system is to support UKIP and to attempt to make a political difference. I don't know whether I can do that, but I will certainly try.
Thank you. Andy.
Thank you, Georgia. Oops. That's a pretty good start. There we go. My name is Andy Nash. It's my first time standing as a candidate, as I'm sure it is for a couple of us here. We have a lot in common. You'll have heard many things you agree with from all the candidates you've heard so far, and I'm sure you'll hear more you agree with again. We can all talk, but it's all about action. We Liberal Democrats have a vision for the future. This election is all about the future, more than any other election I can remember. It's going to set the course of this country for a long period of time. And I think we need to ask ourselves what sort of future that needs to be. Is it one that's open, that's tolerant, that is working in conjunction with our neighbours for the good of all? Or is it withdrawing into ourselves, being selfish, perhaps not spending as much as we want to on public services because we want to see taxes low? I don't want any of those things. I don't want any of those low tax solutions. I would like to fund public services properly. Now, in that respect, I said we agree with a lot of things. I agree with Hilary on many of those things. But where I think we differ greatly is that we must actually put up a fight against Brexit. It's all very well complaining about Erasmus. It's all very well complaining against the future opportunities that you guys are not going to enjoy if we do leave the European Union and don't get a decent deal. At the end of the day, I'm sorry, I do have to point out that Hilary voted for Article 50, along with most Labour MPs. Now, that's rather unfortunate. I know some of the reasons they did it. I don't think they're particularly sensible reasons. I don't think they're good for the country. I certainly don't think they're good for the younger people in the country. And I think that if you would like to see a much brighter future, if you want to see change, a change in direction from the direction we're currently heading down with a very hard Brexit that Theresa May has chosen, that could have been given to her by Nigel Farage on a plate, then I think you should be choosing Liberal Democrat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Alan.
Thank you. Some of you might recognise me from a little while ago. I suspect I don't see many different faces. I don't know if there's anyone that wasn't here the first time. No, I don't think so. So I'll quickly rattle through. I'm Alan. I'm standing in for Gareth Davies, who's the Conservative candidate in Leeds Central, who's a great guy, and you should definitely vote for him. I'm duty-bound to rattle through Coalition of Chaos, strong and stable leadership under Theresa May, as we did in the first half. So I'll get through those again. I'm going to go slightly off message. There is one big reason why I would like you to vote Conservative and give Theresa May a huge, huge victory this time, and it's very simple. Hilary Benn is a man who I had the privilege of standing for election against in 2010, and he beat me handsomely, and it was an honour to be resoundingly defeated by him. He's a man of great principle, of great honour, of great integrity. His speech on Syria in the House of Commons was one of the finest moments in our parliamentary democracy in the last 25 years, I would argue. His party has been stolen from him, and you have the power to give it back. The lunatics have taken over the asylum. The honest, decent, honourable people like Hilary Benn have lost their party. The best way to give it back to them and to have a strong, effective and stable opposition in this country, as well as a strong, stable government, is to give Theresa May a thumping majority and give Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott and John McDonnell a huge bloody nose and give Hilary Benn his Labour Party back. It's a great, proud tradition in this country. They have done great things, and it is desperately sad to see the state they're in today. So for that reason, and that reason alone, please give Theresa May a huge thumping majority next time. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our candidates. So first up, we're going to have a round of quickfire yes or no questions. I'm coming to Ed here first. So Jack Walker, a student at Leeds, wants to know your views on fox hunting. In short, fox hunting, yes or no?
No.
Absolutely yes.
No. Definitely no.
I'm wondering if I should give different answers to all of them, but no, I'm still a no.
And Hilary?
No, animal cruelty is animal cruelty.
Okay, our next quick-fire question, coming to Bill here first, is university education. Should students pay for it, yes or no?
Yes, they should. Yes.
Unfortunately, at the moment, they probably do need to. We can't afford to spend 11 billion wiping out tuition fees. It's very sad, but that's unfortunately the situation we find ourselves in.
Alan?
As before, students, absolutely not. Graduates, absolutely yes.
Hilary?
No, we're campaigning on this election to abolish fees.
Ned?
No.
Thank you. The legalisation of cannabis, coming to Andy here first, yes or no?
Yes. May I expand on that?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Worth a try.
Always worth a try. Alan?
No.
Hilary?
I'm increasingly coming to the view that we should.
Yes.
And
Yes, full legalisation.
thank you. And our final yes or no question. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about how important the votes of young people are to your party. Do you think, coming to Alan here first, that students are properly addressed by and represented in the literature for your party?
Well, as I said earlier, I will be doing my very best to make sure that they are.
Hilary?
Well, I hope so, but that's why I'm here tonight.
Ed?
Yes.
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 Okay, thank you very much. So our first topic this evening is living in Leeds. In the run-up to the last general election, 39% of students in Leeds highlighted the affordability of rent as a major concern. Other problems included the cost of transport and high crime rates within popular student areas. And recently we've been hearing a lot about glass recycling. So we're going to start off with talking about student-heavy residential areas, coming to Hilary here first. How do you make locals feel safe and students feel welcome? You've got 1 minute.
Well, first of all, we should increase the resources that go to neighbourhood policing. The biggest change for the better that I've seen over my 18 years as the Member of Parliament here was the advent of neighbourhood policing, which built a relationship between the community and the police. But police numbers have been cut, and we're committed to putting more police into those teams and elsewhere. I don't know whether we're going to come to the affordability of housing, but renters have a very raw deal. We need more stability, longer-term tenancies. We need to make sure that student renters don't have to pay lettings agent fees. Now, that we fought on that 2 years ago. The Tories attacked it as a ridiculous, you didn't use the word nonsensical tonight, that's a mercy idea. They claim that they're going to introduce it. And we also need some certainty about what happens to rent increases during the term of that tenancy. And thirdly, build a relationship with the people who are your neighbours.
Thank you, Hilary. Ed?
Yep. So some definite similarities. I suppose neighbourhood policing is an obvious one, and as Hilary said, it's being cut massively. I think probably the major selling point for me for the Green Party is that the Green Party are radically committed in a way that I don't think any of the other parties are to a radical decentralisation of power. I think we need more participative communities. I think we need that starts with devolution to the regions, but I also think it's devolved right down to local communities. I think we have an incredibly centralised political system with a huge amount of power in London. We need it into cities like Leeds, and we need it into our communities. Yes to housing reform, that's in our manifesto as well. And again, I think it's really important for politicians to say that it's not for governments to do everything. Government can create the conditions for communities to thrive, but actually it's not for government to run our communities.
Thank you. Bill.
So I think we can probably cut the waffle on this. The reason that student accommodation costs are so high is because of a shortage of rented accommodation. And the reason for that is the planning permission restrictions imposed by Leeds City Council. So I think the single biggest thing to reduce student living costs would be to allow much more construction of housing for students and rented accommodation in general. I think it's a very, very simply solved problem.
Thank you. Andy.
Well, in terms of crime, we plan on investing heavily in the police, 300 million. They've faced real terms cuts for many years now. We plan on investing 300 million into the police services nationally. In terms of housing, we actually would like to build more houses and get involved in building houses if developers aren't willing to do so themselves. Now, there's many reasons why developers don't build houses. Some of it might be land banking, they're waiting for a future value to rise. Some of it might be brownfield development. Some of it might be other reasons. But we would like to actually get involved, and we're committing to building 300,000 houses each year of a parliament.
Thank you. And Alan.
Just quickly, a reminder on policing, that one of the reasons the police numbers have been cut in Leeds is because the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner has sat on reserves of £103 million at the same time as allowing police vacancies to be left unfilled. That is a disgrace, and I hope Hilary will do a lot more to put pressure on him to actually spend that money in the way it's supposed to be spent and getting police officers on the street where they should be. The second thing I wanted to say, which I didn't touch on earlier, I'm the chair of the Environment and Housing Scrutiny Board in Leeds. At the council, and one of the things we've been looking at is the private rented sector. There's an awful lot more work to be done there. What wasn't touched on earlier is this government has brought in powers and legislation for councils to be able to enforce better standards and more rigorous standards on private landlords. Leeds City Council have done precisely no prosecutions under the new powers that they have. There's an awful lot more to be done, and there's a lot of work that we will be doing as a scrutiny board to look into that, but the powers are there.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to open the questions to the floor. If anyone has a question about living Leeds, please raise your hand and we'll get a row mic to you. We've got a question here.
Thank you. I've spoken to many members of the public, homeless people in this case, who are very reticent to go to places like the Crypt. They really don't like them. What can be done to make these places more accessible to homeless people? And on a similar issue about homelessness, there's an issue with certain areas in the public that can't be used, for example, for homeless pop-up shops, purely because they're in between uses between something like residency and retail. What can be done, and how will you be working with Bob Blackman, for example, were you elected MP, on this issue of homelessness? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Ed, we're coming to you first here.
I've heard the same thing about organisations in Leeds working with the homeless. I've got friends who've worked for some of those organisations who've left disappointed. I think it's a funny one. I guess there's always a balance between rigour and kind of stifling bureaucracy. And I think, so also having worked in a homeless shelter, although not in Leeds, I suppose there is a huge amount of kind of paperwork, as is the case with the education system, the health system, all this kind of stuff, overlaid, which makes things increasingly difficult. So just across the road from where I work, there used to be 20 years ago an incredibly thriving Salvation Army hostel. It was very vibrant, it was truly independent. It went down the route of government contracting, and ultimately it had the life squeezed out of it. So I'd like to see more freedom in that kind of freedom from regulation. I also think we should experiment with really radical ways of looking at things. I think there are some really good pilots where universal basic income has been piloted with small numbers of homeless people and has had an immense impact.
Thank you. Bill?
So I think that as long as the facilities are available to homeless people, it is not something that you can necessarily force people to use. You can't necessarily judge a homeless shelter as unsuccessful simply because a number of homeless people choose not to use it, particularly as there may be restrictions in that shelter that say that you cannot become extremely drunk there or bring alcohol in. And ultimately, for that shelter to be successful, they will have to have those restrictions, and it is likely that some people will simply not be willing to do that. I think in general, you can have I think it's more important to allow people who are homeless, and they are, if you say, the expression is down on their luck, and to give them an opportunity to go back into the workforce and from there re-enter society rather than having special facilities.
Thank you. Andy?
I would agree with some of those comments already, and to add to that, I think it's important we look at the root causes of homelessness, mental health, drug dependency, things like that, and we can't simply look at solving the problem of people being on the streets all the time. We need to actually try and make sure they don't end up on the streets in the first place. So yes, mental health, decriminalising drugs will hopefully help reduce that. Building more homes will help that situation too.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. Again, my scrutiny board has been looking at the issues of homelessness, and this is one area actually I can give the Labour Council in Leeds a lot of credit, where they've done a huge amount of work, supported by all the other parties, to the point where I can sit here and say there is no need for any person in Leeds to sleep rough on the streets of our city. It doesn't mean they don't, but there is places and support for them to go anywhere in the city. Tackling the causes of homelessness is a huge issue and very complicated. We touched on mental health earlier on, and it's one of the big issues and the big challenges that we have to face. Getting to the root causes of homelessness and actually helping people to turn their lives around is huge. It's very resource intensive, but it's one of those things you can't put a price on it, you can't put a cost on it, you need to do it. It takes people to want to turn their lives around as well, and they have to engage with the process. If I would make one plea that came out of our scrutiny report, please don't give homeless people money. It makes the situation worse. Buy them a sandwich, buy them a coffee. There's vouchers you can get. We need to do more to smartphone technology and things, but please don't give money.
Thank you. Hilary.
Well, I agree with what you said, Alan, about what's been done in the city, because the council, the voluntary agencies, I've supported the CRIP for a long time, and I'm sorry when I hear, I mean, not you in asking the question, but other people having a go at them. You know, they have been working to support people in real trouble since the 1930s, when Don Robbins, the vicar, turned up and decided he would empty the crypt of the bones of the dead to provide for the needs of the living who were having a tough time. So we should speak up for those organisations, Simon on the Streets and many others. It is very complex, but it is true. The council and the agencies who work really closely together say there is no need, but Bill is right. For some people, they're not able to stick by the rules. If you're going to go into a shelter and start shooting up, the shelter may say, I'm sorry, you can't do that here. And it's how you tackle those reasons. There's other types of homelessness. You know, some catastrophe occurs. Lastly, on the pop-up shop, if that's an issue and you'd like to pursue it further subsequently, depending on the outcome of the election, I'm sure whoever wins would be interested to assist you.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on now to our next topic, which is Brexit. With 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting to remain, many students are wondering who will get the best deal for them now that Article 50 has been triggered. So we've got a question that's come in on Twitter. Don't forget you can still tweet in your questions for the next coming up topics at Leeds Union #G17. This question is from Alan Shears. Should your party gain a majority on election day, will you be supporting Brexit or pushing for a second referendum? And Bill, we're coming to you here first.
Are these yes/no questions?
No. You've got 1 minute.
Okay, so obviously as the UKIP candidate, we'll certainly not be reversing Brexit. This is something that UKIP have worked for approximately 25 years or more, and we see this as the single biggest, most important opportunity this country's had in certainly my own lifetime. I think if we can now, we should be looking at more how to build the best trading relationships with the EU and how to ensure that Britain and the EU are not in a situation of conflict. But ultimately, this does have to be a self-interested process.
Thank you. Andy.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about building great trade relationships with the EU for a start, because we already have some fantastic trading relationships with the EU in the form of the single market. Yes, of course, we would want a second referendum. We find ourselves in a difficult position. We've lost the referendum. We're not going to try and tell everybody that they were stupid. We're not going to tell them that they were xenophobic. They weren't. I do feel many were misled. But what I do feel is important, referring back to what Hilary said earlier, is that we weren't told how we would leave. No prospectus was issued for the form this country would take after we leave. And that's now going to develop over the next year or two. When that deal is finally available, I do believe we will have a much better idea collectively what we should do. And I do believe the answer will probably be we're better off remaining. So I feel very strongly that people, and it's the people who should decide, not MPs, it's the people, because it's the people who made the initial decision. Only they can actually overturn their own decision. It would be illegitimate to do it any other way, I think.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. I was a Remainer. I'm sad in many ways that we're leaving the European Union, but the decision has been made. And I'm sorry, but it's showing a huge lack of disrespect a huge lack of respect to the British people to say that we're just going to keep having another go and another go until you get the right answer. And actually, I think what the Liberal Democrats are saying is exactly that people were too stupid to know what they were voting for. Nick Clegg was caught on camera, and it played back to him saying Brexit will mean leaving the single market. It was very clear what people were voting for, and it's not right or fair to have another go. It's going to cause chaos if we do. The choice at the election is clear. It's whether you want Theresa May sat at the negotiating table or Jeremy Corbyn. And what is not realistic is to think that you can have Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn and 65 million other people sat there trying to conduct a negotiation. It's simply not practical or going to work. We have to put our trust in someone, and I will put my trust in Theresa May all day long.
It's time.
You've had your go.
That's fine, thank you. Hilary.
Look, as I said earlier, I'm sorry we're leaving, but I think people knew exactly what they were voting for. And the reason to respond to Andy, the reason I voted for the Article 50 legislation is very simply this. If we hadn't in Parliament, if we had voted it down and basically said to the British people who voted, you didn't know what you were doing, we know better than you, go away, we have enough of a crisis of confidence in our politics in this country. I think many of us on the table would reflect that. We really would have a crisis of confidence in our politics if that were to happen. And do you know who the beneficiaries would be? It wouldn't be the Liberal Democrats. It wouldn't be the Labour Party. It would be the populists. And there are enough populists about in Britain and in Europe and in the world. And we have to respect the outcome of the referendum. So I'm not in favour of saying, go and do your homework again, because we don't like the outcome. What we have to do, as I said at the beginning, is to get the best possible deal that maintains trading relationships, cooperation, participation in all of the things that we think are important, while recognising we're leaving the institutions.
Thank you. And Ed.
Yep, so the question was, would I resist and fight for a second referendum, or would I let it go? I suppose, echoing what others have said, I think it would be utterly immoral for Westminster to try to resist Brexit. But I do think the stakes are very high. It is obviously such a huge, huge step. I think Alan invited us to trust the government. I don't think I can trust Theresa May, especially when you look at her style. We have many friends in the EU. It seems like she's keen to get rid of as many of them as possible. We need to hold whichever government it is to account as they make these negotiations. And so I absolutely believe, and the Green Party believes, in giving the people the power, ultimately, to sign off or knock back the final deal. I personally have, as Hilary will back me up on this one, I have some ambivalence about the Brexit vote. I wasn't passionate either way. So personally, I'm not committed to trying to resist anything, but I do think that people need the power to sign it off or knock it back.
Thank you. So I'd now like to open questions to the floor. Would anyone like to raise? Okay, we've got some hands up on this side. Sorry, it's still quite bright on stage. Questions about Brexit. Thank you.
Hello. So on leaving the European Union, obviously one of the things that we currently have protection of is the European Convention of Human Rights. When we do leave, how will you ensure that your party preserves workers' rights, particularly those of lower paid workers, with some of the changes that may come in from us leaving the European Union?
Thank you. So coming, Andy, to you first.
Well, clearly, I think losing the ability to rely on the European Court of Human Rights is a colossal mistake. Anything we do to enable Brexit, to enable us to leave such institutions, and there are others as well, your ATOM, the ECJ, I think has to be based on retaining as much as possible. Now, we have to face a reality, and that is that Theresa May is in charge. She'll be in charge after this election. We know that already. And that means we need a strong opposition to fight for things like that. That means we need to see as many sensible MPs in Parliament after this election as possible. Preferably Liberal Democrat MPs, because we can help avoid leaving in the first place, but also Labour MPs who may be sympathetic to putting up a strong opposition to this. What we can't do is let those on the right who have some rather extreme views, who have now taken over the Tory party. In fact, there's many UKIPers now in the Tory party. Even candidates. The last central candidate is now a Conservative. We mustn't let them set the agenda.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. Well, the Conservative Party I know and am involved in, and probably know a bit more about it than the chap to my left, is not an extreme place. There are not very many extreme views, and I hope you'll agree from the time this evening that if you elect me in Leeds North West or Gareth in Leeds Central, you'll have sensible people looking to do the best for our country. The choice, again, and we were talking specifically about the ECHR, a lot of those laws are already enshrined in British law, and personally, when it comes to workers' rights, I would want to fight to maintain what's there, and over time, as we have done through our history, we should be looking to strengthen workers' rights. We touched earlier about apprenticeships, unpaid internships and things like that, and we should be looking to outlaw unpaid internships. We should be looking to make sure apprentices get paid a proper wage. There's all sorts of policies and things we can do, but we should constantly be looking to improve workers' rights with or without the EU.
Thank you. Hilary.
Well, did you say the European Convention on Human Rights? Is that what you mentioned? Yeah, because we're not leaving. The referendum result doesn't mean we leave the European Convention on Human Rights, because that's separate from the European Union, because we joined that in 1951. Indeed, we helped to draft the European Convention. And the last Labour government put what that convention says in law through the Human Rights Act. And unfortunately, one of the things that the Conservatives want to do is to get rid of the Human Rights Act and replace it with something called a British Bill of Rights. But when it comes to the right of privacy and not to be imprisoned without trial and so on, what is the difference between what we've got at the moment and a British Bill of Rights? We should fight to uphold the Human Rights Act, and that's a risk from what a future Conservative government would do. On workers' rights, we've got to keep every single one of those things. The Working Time Directive brought paid holiday, limits on unsafe hours for lorry drivers. Tired drivers are more likely to have accidents. We've got to ensure that all of that is maintained in our legislation, but unfortunately there are those in the Tory party. In the referendum, one cabinet minister said, when asked to give an example of what he wanted to get rid of, he said bureaucracy and red tape, health and safety. It's not bureaucracy and red tape. It helps us to come home to our families at night having done a safe day's work.
Thank you. Ed.
Yeah, just, I mean, echoing what you're saying, there is much at stake, there is much at risk. Echoing what others have said, I don't think we can trust the Conservative government. I do think they want to burn our bridges. I think they want to tear up a whole load of things. I think, pushing through this, the Great Repeal Act, I think it's called, it's kind of wanting to put throw a lot of those things out. Yes, so I think that's dangerous. I mean, I suppose specifically about, at this time, politicians will always make many promises, and there's plenty of rhetoric. With all due respect to Alan, he's saying, well, of course we're for workers' rights. But if you look at the track record of the Conservative government over the years, their track record on workers' rights is not good.
Thank you. And Bill.
So I would echo Hilary Benn's point about the European Convention on Human Rights being a different organisation. But I do think that we are losing sight of the point that the single most important workers' right is the right to sell one's labour to the highest bidder. Ultimately, it is not these type of rules and increasing controls over employment that benefit workers. In fact, these things tend to be detrimental to workers. So I myself would advocate, now that we're leaving the EU, I would advocate leaving the European Convention of Human Rights, and I would advocate that the concept of workers' rights needs to be entirely rethought into one where it's seen as people are seen as having independent agency and the ability to choose themselves as adults who they do business with.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on to our next section, but if we have time at the end, we'll return to take some more Brexit questions from the floor. So our next section we're going to discuss is education. The government has just passed the Higher Education Bill, which will allow universities to increase their tuition fees based on the bronze, silver and gold rating of the Teaching Excellence Framework, as some of you may know. So let's move straight to taking some questions from the audience about education. Please raise your hand if you have one. Got one here, to my right, because she's coming down.
Thank you. So in the previous debate, Greg Mulholland said that politicians have let down our generation. And to echo that point, what I find disappointing is that the debate for higher education is very much singly focused on tuition fees. Should the government pay for them, or should it be students? But actually, in my case, whether it's the students paying for education or the government, there has actually been little scrutiny of the value of education received. So, for example, if it's the government or myself, I currently pay £9,000 for 4 contact hours a week. So my question would be, if elected, what would members of the panel do to scrutinise higher education? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Alan, we're coming to you first for this question.
Thank you. Well, specifically on the point you raised, I think there's a lot of opportunities to condense degrees and make them shorter, which is one of the things the government have introduced, which means the amount of debt and tuition fee you'd have to pay is a lot less, and there's a chance to get through a degree and into the world of work a lot more quickly. For me personally, there is nothing more important that the government can do than deliver a good education to people of all ages. I think one of the points you made was around whether you pay or the government pay. That's not really the point. The government doesn't have any money. It has what it takes in taxes from other people. So it's either you pay or everybody else pays. In terms of education, what saddens me, we should celebrate the fact unemployment is really low today. It's at a historic low. But what bothers me is youth unemployment is still far too high. It's come down and it's coming down. But there's a stubborn number of young people who we need to do an awful lot more to help them access the labour market. It's a big problem in Leeds, it's a big problem in the country, and in government I would want to do an awful lot more to tackle that.
Thank you. Hilary.
Well, I voted against the trebling of tuition fees in the 2010-15 government. I agree we shouldn't just concentrate on universities and higher education, important though it is. That's why I talked earlier about the educational maintenance allowance. Because if you think of the divide in our city between those who have opportunity and what education gives us in terms of aspiration, plus the encouragement of our families, it's really important that we enable those from low-income backgrounds to be able to stay on. The educational maintenance allowances made a big difference. The Conservatives, when they came in, they abolished them. We are committed to reinstate them and the student maintenance grants, because we don't want anyone who wants to go into further and higher education to be put off from doing so for lack of means or fear about how they're going to be able to fund it. Because it's fundamental to the future of our economy, because we are going to be successful and continue to be successful on the back of the skills that we generate as a country, and that's why education matters so much.
Thank you. Ed.
Yeah, so once again, in the lead up to the election, we all hear many promises and plenty of rhetoric from different parties. Once again, I would say, the Tories' track record in the last few years and in the past, in the 1980s, for example, on education is not good. It has seen a stripping back of funding across the education sector. Equally, though, I suppose looking at track record, it's important to recognise that Labour instigated tuition fees, which in turn ballooned under the coalition in 2010-2015. There is an alternative. Countries like Germany, that well-known basket case, have no tuition fees for students. We can rethink this. And people say, well, we can't afford it. Well, how can we? There's a whole load of things that we seem to be able to afford. We seem to be able to afford what looks like £200 billion for Trident. We seem to be able to afford giving zero tax on the aviation industry. That tax alone, fair taxation of the aviation industry would get us £10 billion a year, which would nearly plug the hole on tuition fees. So why don't we do that?
Thank you. Bill.
The way I see this is that I think the primary beneficiaries of education is obviously the individual students themselves. So I do not support a high degree of state support for students. For instance, I think that it is not reasonable to expect working people to be taxed to pay for the education of students. I think that one of the ways that we could improve this is to move towards a system where the very significant amount of taxpayer support at the moment that goes into student loans was something that was a burden that fell onto universities, and that the university would make a decision based on the students' their take on the students' lifetime earnings prospects to decide on what their students' repayments would be after graduation.
That's time. Is it okay if we just let Andy finish and then we'll come back to you? Great. Andy.
So, yes, tuition fees. It's worth probably mentioning that our current leader, Tim Farron, also voted against tuition fees. We would love to get rid of tuition fees. It's not necessarily practical to do so when looking at the whole of a manifesto in the round. That's what we believe anyway. We do think education is massively important. Of course we do. Every party does. So the way we're spending our money that we have available to us on education is targeting at those who need it most. So, for example, reinstating the maintenance allowances, reinstating nurses' bursaries. And we're also focusing a lot of money on schools, reversing Conservative cuts and protecting things like pupil premium, which we brought in the last coalition. In fact, my wife has done a lot of work with pupil premium. She's a teacher and supervised how it was spent in her school. And I've seen the benefits of that. To answer your question very, very quickly, I believe one way we can do that is transparency, provide greater transparency of how your money is spent on each individual course by the university so that you can see what you're actually getting for your money, because that's a car you're buying every year. It's a lot of money.
Thank you. So we've heard from each of the candidates. Did you want to follow up on the point that you already made?
So perhaps I didn't express it very well when I asked the question, but what I'm really looking for is for people of the panel to go beyond the debate of simply how is tuition fees financed and just add a bit more nuance to the fact of how do we ensure the country as a whole make sure that degrees are of their full value, whether that's the state or the taxpayers, as you say, were paying for it, or the students. I just think it's fundamentally illogical that £9,000 equates to 4 contact hours a week. That's not in the political debate at all.
So you're moving away from tuition fees more towards the quality of the education that you're getting for the money?
I don't think there's any scrutiny beyond students themselves on that debate.
I think he's right.
Okay, well,
as well.
Let's return to Alan. Should we just do 30 seconds each to respond to this part of your question? Is that okay?
Yeah. So you're talking essentially about whether it's value for money for either the taxpayer or the student. The reason I think the system we have is a good and fair system is a good education should be a choice and a right, and it's not necessarily because you want to pursue a particular career. Having the opportunity to learn and study throughout life is really important. You might not want to do it at 18, you might want to do it further down the line. So I think there should be much more flexibility in the fee system, in the degree system, but it shouldn't just be about
10 seconds.
What job you're going to do. Learning is a great thing that you should do throughout your life, and having the opportunity to go to university is something that the current policy means anybody can do regardless of how much money they've got.
Thank you. Hilary.
Well, I think that sounds to me like a bit of a campaign that you and your fellow students might like to take up, because certainly the fact that students are now paying fees has made them more aware of what they're getting for the money that they will be contributing in the future when they pay back. Pardon?
Can't you do the campaign?
Well, let's do it together. I mean, but it seems to me the people who have the strongest interest and the greatest force are students supported by others. That's the first point. And the second is look at what different universities are offering in terms of taught time. And if students start making decisions on the basis of someone offers more than another institution, well, then those who are offering less may get the message.
Thank you. Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we just need to step back and see, what's the overarching narrative, to use a that kind of higher education language, so I did an English degree. We are, society is becoming increasingly commodified. The neoliberal economic agenda, I can talk more about that if you want, is turning everything, including businesses and schools, into universities and schools into businesses. Yes, of course, we need rigour, but I also think we need to step back and try to question the role of the market to shape everything we do, and actually try to liberate the education system to be, I suppose, more healthy, more vibrant, and less
that's time.
Whatever.
Phil.
Well, yeah, regarding what you said, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's what you're complaining there about value for money is a problem that we see in all aspects of society, and it's called institutional capture, where what was an institution for learning has become captured by a expensive bureaucracy of a sort that is very good at converting ultimately taxpayers' money, with you on the hook for it in later life,
10 seconds.
Right, into a means for a valuable career. But it certainly does not necessarily help the student.
Thank you. And Andy.
I think it's a tricky one because this has actually been happening since before Labour introduced tuition fees, in a way, and that they were getting money from central government, and in the case of some students, were providing more services, and in the case of other students, less. So it's normally hidden, isn't it, by the way that these things are funded. So what's now become obvious is that you can see what you're getting for your money. And if you're going to end up as a hospital consultant, you're going to get a lot of money, and you're going to actually be able to see that's worthwhile. I think really you need to go into it eyes wide open. You need to be able to see exactly how your money is going to be spent. I'm not averse to the idea of differential charging on different courses.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn now to health. Many students have concerns about the future of the NHS, as well as local provision for mental health support, with 1 in 4 people experiencing mental health problems. And being a student can, of course, come with a great deal of pressure. So I've got some questions here, but I'd like to open up to the floor first. So any questions from the floor regarding health? Yeah, go down to the front row with him.
Yeah, hello. I think this broadly goes under health as well. That I would like to ask about. I'd like to ask what do all candidates think about the cutbacks on benefits on welfare that is causing extreme lack of health, both physical and mental, for instance, for disabled people across the UK.
Thank you. So coming to Hilary here first about the cuts.
Well, I asked a parliamentary question recently, which was very simply this: what percentage of people in Leeds who appeal against their personal independence payment assessment and go to the tribunal win? And do you know what the answer was? 57%. And for many of those people, they get a letter saying they're not been given the higher rate. That means they lose their Motability car. And for many people, their car is their means to go to work, to earn an income, to pay their mortgage. So one letter, one wrong assessment that may be overturned on appeal means their entire life is about to change. Now, there's something fundamentally wrong with a system where 57% of the people who appeal are winning because the assessment wasn't done right the first time round. So if we won, that is something that we would need to get right, because these are important decisions, they're life-changing, and you can't have a system which gets it wrong in so many cases.
Thank you. Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to echo what Hilary was saying. I was scribbling some notes, and he said everything that I was about to say, which is a bit disappointing. I mean, I suppose an anecdote. I mean, many of you might know these kind of people, but yeah, I was talking to a lady in Hunslet just a couple of weeks ago, and she's had that experience, exactly what Hilary's just described. She had a PIP assessment, personal independence payment assessment, had it knocked back. She's had to wade through piles of paperwork. She's been fighting for months and months and months. She is utterly crushed. As you said, she's lost her car. Your lives are being wrecked, and the fact that she has been so tenacious and has had a huge support from people around her means that she's still staying the fight, but a whole load of other people are giving up on the fight. And it is crushing people, and it's crushing, it's just not a humane way to run our society. Somebody should really correct me if I'm wrong. My feeling is that in the 2000s, kind of under Labour, there was still some kind of rigorous stuff. I know people who were being thrown off disability allowance in the early 2000s as well. I think Labour was doing it to some extent as well.
Sorry, thank you. Bill.
One of an issue of concern to me that I've observed has been that the very, very high numbers in the car industry, a very large proportion of car sales today, of new car sales, is to the Motability scheme. Now, the reality is that for very many people, their car is their source of their livelihood. There is not a distinction between the disabled and the non-disabled when it comes to the vital importance of motor transport. It does concern me to see that such a high proportion now of new cars are in fact being provided in a way that actually it's perfectly reasonable to expect someone who is in employment and has to be able to provide their own transport. And it's something that the purpose of these things is...
Thank you. Andy.
I'd just like to pick up on that point very quickly. I think it's absolutely obvious, surely, that for disabled people, access to a car is of immense importance.
And democracy.
Well, yes, but I think well, anyway, I think that point should be obvious. We're looking to reverse many of the government's cuts to welfare for all sorts of groups of people. You'll find it in our manifesto, which has been announced today. It's one of the key platforms we're standing on. So I think a lot of benefits have been pulled away unnecessarily. I think this problem of process, of applying and forms and appeals and so on, actually goes beyond those sorts of things you mentioned. I mean, I think it goes into the way people interact with their council as well. I'm a councillor also, and I get similar issues in that regard. I think it makes tough lives even tougher, and I think it's rather unfair. I think we need to have a default position which is a little bit more generous and kind-hearted than it is right now.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. And first of all, I'm not sure I'm in the same debate as the UKIP candidate anymore. Second, I think it's a really important question that you've asked. As a city councillor, I've dealt with lots of people in these positions. And while on the point of principle, we should be making sure that those people who can take responsibility for themselves do, because that means we've got the biggest resource for those people that need more help and support to live independent lives and fulfilling lives. The problem we have is the system is too clunky and too cumbersome. It's not something, I'm not going to sit here and defend some of the things that have taken place. There needs to be much more done to get the system to be more personal, to be more empathetic, and to actually genuinely help people and make sure if there is going to be a change, there's a sensible transition from where they are to where they're going to be, and that they're properly supported. This business of clunky, arbitrary lines of changing things, that's not acceptable to me, and that's something that I would absolutely want to tackle in Parliament.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to move on, just in the interest of time, to our final topic of tonight's question time, which is the environment. I've got a couple of questions here from Josh Alston. I think Josh is here. Is Josh here? Would you like to choose one of your questions to ask to the candidates?
Do you support Divest Parliament and the university's campaign to, and People and Planet's campaign to get the university and the Parliamentary Pension Fund divested from fossil fuels?
Okay, so Ed, we're coming to you here first about divesting from fossil fuels. If you'd like to answer.
Now, shock horror, as the Green candidate, yes, I do. I think we desperately need to transition out of our addiction to fossil fuels. We're wrecking the planet. Successive governments over, I don't know, for as long as anybody's been talking about it, I don't think have taken adequate action on climate change. I think different parties have different approaches. There are lesser evils, but I do think only the Green Party has a genuinely strong vision for a green industrial revolution, for a steady transition, fast but steady transition out of the fossil fuel industry to a low carbon society, which we all need and which the planet needs.
Thank you. Bill.
I think the question was regarding the parliamentary pension scheme, was it not? Yes. Okay, so I do not agree with the parliamentary pension scheme. I think when MPs leave office, they should not continue to receive payments. Regarding fossil fuels, this is the fundamental backbone of our economy. You're sitting there on a seat made out of a fossil fuel. All the goods that get into the shops and feed you are brought there by fossil fuels. I think it's ridiculous to talk in terms of moving away from fossil fuels. It's the backbone of civilization. It's why we're not starving. So I think this is a completely wrong direction to go in, and very harmful, deluded, in fact.
Thank you. Sorry, can we have quiet? Thank you. Andy.
Follow that. This is an area where we share, I think, in most part, probably at least three of our parties, very, very similar agenda. We obviously need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. There's some differences about how fast we do that. In terms of the parliamentary pension scheme, I'm not too familiar with the details, to be honest, but in terms of our council pension scheme, that is divested already, and I think that's a great thing. And I think that certainly is something that should be applied to other public services, so I'd agree with that. I think what we're seeing at the moment, in fact, since the end of coalition, during which we did some amazing good in terms of increasing, in terms of helping the renewables industry, we've seen all of that rolled back, or a lot of that rolled back. And we've seen a openness towards more fracking, which
10 seconds
is unnecessary. If we actually invest, if we put our money where our mouth is and actually invest in renewables, we can actually make them more affordable. They're becoming more affordable all the time, and we really do not need to encourage the fracking industry as much as the Conservatives seem to be doing at the moment.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about this. And the biggest piece of work that my scrutiny board has been doing this year is around air quality, which is one of the biggest issues affecting the city and the country. 40,000 deaths are attributed each year to poor air quality, and the main source of that is from diesel cars. Doing short journeys in big cities. We were encouraged not too long ago to all buy diesel cars. I'm one of those that's guilty of taking that advice from the government and is now trying to extract myself. But in terms of energy policy, the things we need to keep the lights on. We need to make sure our supply of energy is secure, that we're not relying on questionable regimes such as Russia and places like that for our energy supply. We need more scientists to invest in this area. We need more engineers particularly, and we don't have enough engineering graduates. I hope there's some engineers and scientists here. There's an awful lot of work to do, but improving our air quality and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels while keeping energy safe, cheap and secure are the key principles that the government should be pursuing.
Thank you. And Hilary.
Well, look, we have made progress as a country because our CO2 emissions are down, and that's in part because of the leadership that we showed through the Climate Change Act. Clearly, the vast majority of the fossil fuels that are currently underground are going to have to stay underground if we are going to avoid dangerous climate change. Now, there's a specific issue about trustees of pension funds because they have an obligation to get the best return, and they can't be instructed by anybody else what to do. But I've said, we had a meeting here in Leeds Uni last week on this very subject, and I said I'd be happy to sign the early day motion if it comes back, calling on them to review it. But that's only part of it, because if everyone who cares about climate change sells their shares in fossil fuel companies, and they're bought by people who don't care about climate change, well, what decisions are those fossil fuel companies going to make about the future? So it seems to me it's half of the campaign, because what we really want is not the dive. Well, we don't want people to invest in the future extraction. We want to invest in alternative energy sources, in particular renewables. And that is really, we've got to focus our effort, because once you show people you can get all of the mobility and benefits that Bill was talking about, but you don't have to do it by burning fossil fuels, then that's going to help us to make progress. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Thank you.
Apologies.
If you'd like to. So in the interest of finishing at 8 o'clock, because I know everyone has a lot of revision and so on at the moment, we're going to move to our closing statements. So I'd like to invite each candidate to give a 1-minute closing statement on why they think students should vote for them. And Bill, coming to you first for this.
So one thing I think that tonight has revealed is the great similarity between the other candidates and the frequent, in fact, agreements with the sitting MP, Mr. Benn, regarding Labour Party policy. I think that it is entirely clear that actually only UKIP is in fact offering a genuine political alternative that favours commerce and favours the improvements in living standards and the increase in personal freedom. And I think that if you were to give your vote to any of the other parties, you would be voting for an essentially socialist system that has been of no benefit whatsoever. I think it will be...
10 seconds.
I think that you should be aware that you are not, that the other candidates are essentially voting for the same thing.
That's time. Thank you. Andy.
Well, if caring for everybody in our society without exception, and if looking after the vulnerable makes me a socialist, I guess I'm a socialist. I'm not, but there we go. I'd like to come back on a couple of things people said about Brexit very quickly. Because Nick Clegg said one thing on one day, that means everybody knew what they were doing when they voted. We had many people in the Brexit campaign saying that we would stay in the EFTA, that we would stay in the single market. So there was definitely confusion, but what we really didn't have was a prospectus for what will happen when we leave. And we must see that plan before we sell ourselves down the river. It's incredibly important. I think it's disingenuous to say that you care about public services, that you want to fund public services with more money, when you know that Brexit will make us poorer. It will make us poorer. It will mean there is less money around to put into the NHS, less money around to put into education. This is the Brexit election for that reason. But that is fundamental. If people want to spend billions, they need to think about Brexit a lot harder. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Alan.
Thank you. Well, I really didn't expect to come here and be accused of being a socialist. Many other things, but a socialist, that's a new one. So to finish off where I started, what the UKIP candidate doesn't seem to have grasped, perhaps he didn't see the Labour manifesto launch, but more than any other time in the last 50 years, there really is a clear choice at this election between the strong and stable leadership of Theresa May or the coalition of chaos. And I'm glad Hilary reminded me to mention that Jeremy Corbyn is completely nonsensical. He did point that out at the beginning, so thanks, Hilary. There is a clear choice. The policies are very distinctive, but I finish how I started. This is a precious chance you get to go and change and vote for whoever you want. If everybody in every constituency voted, the people that didn't vote for someone else, it could change the result completely. And finally, I would encourage you to give Theresa May a huge majority, and please, 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 for the sake of the country, give Hilary Benn his Labour Party back. Thank you.
Thank you. Hilary, if you'd like to make your closing statement.
Yes. Look, this election is about one thing. Are we going to accept things as they are? Because if we'd done that 200 years ago, Bill, children would still be working in mines. The fact is, we have progressed as a society for a reason, and do we think it is possible to change things for the better? And the reason I teased you, Alan, about the word nonsensical is when we say we think children in primary school should have free school meals, because, you know, hungry children, there are a lot of hungry children in this constituency, can't learn. That's not nonsensical. When we say that the nursing bursary should be brought back, that is not nonsensical. When we say that we want to strengthen neighbourhood policing, those are sensible policies. And that's why I would urge you to vote Labour. But as others did in the closing end of the last round, please register if you haven't. I'm sure you have because you're here today. Please vote, participate, because it really matters that you play a part along with your friends and neighbours in deciding how the country is going to be governed.
Thank you. And over to you, Ed.
Yep, so similarly, thanks for coming. It's been great to share this hour or so with you. It is a cliche, but as one of my colleagues said earlier, you know, we are at a crossroads. I do think we have wildly different potential futures ahead of us. I think this election is significant. My invitation always is just to step back and try to look afresh at our society. We live in a daft society with a daft economy. It doesn't make sense. It's loaded against fairness, against vibrancy, against healthiness. And I have to say that successive governments in different ways have failed to really tackle the big issues. I do think the Green Party offers a radical, genuine break from the past. There is an alternative. Please vote, as Hilary said, please vote on the 8th of June, whatever you do. But more importantly, participation isn't just about voting. Whatever happens on the 8th of June, I'm not going anywhere. The Green Party is not going anywhere. The struggle for a fairer, humane society continues. And please get involved.
Thank you. Okay, so 8:01, nearly on the dot. I'd like to say thank you so much to all of the candidates and the audience members for giving up your time to be here this evening. Students, I know we've got a lot going on. This whole event will be made available online thanks to LSTV, so you can tell people to catch up on it. I hope what you've heard this evening will enable you to make a fully informed decision when you vote on the 8th of June. And please make sure that you've registered to vote. The deadline is May the 22nd, so that's less than a week now. For myself, this is the last event I'm hosting in my role as forum facilitator, so I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone I've worked with at the Change and Engage office, and I would just urge you, as others have done, to get out and vote and have your voice heard. Thank you very much.